The sky above the Sawtooth Range had no business turning that color. At 4 o'clock on a November afternoon in the year of our Lord 1888, Bannister Whitlock stood in the yard of Iron Hollow Ranch with a splitting axe in his gloved hand and a half-cleaved length of pine at his feet, and he watched the heavens above the western peaks bruise themselves the color of a violet pressed into wet paper. He had seen that exact shade twice before in his 40 years on this earth. The first time was the evening before the second day at Gettysburg, when a Pennsylvania sky had turned the same wounded purple over a wheat field that would swallow more boys than a man could count before the sun rose again. He had been 15 years old then, a drummer boy for the 4th Michigan, and he had stood beside a split-rail fence and looked up at that sky and known in his young bones that something terrible was coming. The second time was the night before his wife Eliza had died in childbirth in the back bedroom of this very house. 11 years ago, this coming February, her hand growing cold in his while the midwife in the kitchen wept into her apron, and the baby boy never drew the breath he was meant to draw. A sky like that meant the world was about to change, and it was not going to change for the better. Banner let the axe head sink slowly into the chopping block and stood there with his hands resting on the worn hickory handle. His breath came out of him in long white columns that the wind tore away before they could rise. Somewhere down the valley a single crow called, once a short, hoarse note, like the cough of an old man, and then the whole mountain went silent in a way that mountains do not often go silent. The mules in the lean-to stopped chewing. The chickens in the coop stopped scratching. Even the wind, which had been carrying the dry hiss of dead grass for the better part of an hour, settled itself down into a quiet that pressed against the eardrums. Banner thought of Eliza then without meaning to. He thought of how she used to stand on this very porch with her apron tied over her belly, watching weather come down off the ridge, and how she would say to him in that low Tennessee voice of hers that God sent storms the way a man sends a letter. It was the job of those who received them, she said, to sit quiet and read what was written. He had loved that woman more than he ever knew how to say. And when she had died with their unborn son still inside her, he had stopped reading altogether. He had stopped listening to whatever God was trying to tell him. He had decided in the cold gray dawn after the burial that there was nobody on the other end of the line, that prayers were just words a man said to comfort himself in the dark, and that a wise man saved his breath for the work in front of him. But standing there now with that bruised sky pressing down on the Sawtooth Peaks and the air gone still as the inside of a chapel, Bannister Whitlock felt something he had not felt in 11 years. He felt a whisper at the back of his neck. The whisper was not loud. The whisper was barely a whisper at all. But the whisper said plain as a struck bell in a still room that someone was out there and someone needed him. He did not yet know that the whisper was telling the truth. He only knew that the storm was coming and he had work to do. Inside the ranch house, the smell of cornbread and black coffee wrapped around Banner like an old wool coat as he pushed through the door with an armload of split pine cradled against his chest. Cassius Redfern, 31 years old and built like a fence pole, with a man's shoulders bolted on top of it, stood at the cast iron stove, turning a heavy skillet with the patient attention of a man who had learned to cook, because no woman would do it for him. Jericho Hadley, the youngest at 25, sat at the long pine table with the ranch ledger open in front of him, a pencil tucked behind one ear, and his boots hooked through the rung of his chair. "You keep dragging in that much wood, Banner, and folks are going to start saying we expect the devil himself for supper," Cass said without turning from the skillet. "Maybe we do," Banner answered, and something in his voice made both younger men look up at once. Jerry set the pencil down on the open page of the ledger. "What did you see out there?" "Sky's gone the wrong color. Wind's wrong, too. This is not going to be a dusting, boys. This is the kind of storm that kills men who don't know how to get out of its way." Cass wiped his hands slowly on a rag and lifted the skillet off the heat. "How long do you reckon?" 2 hours, maybe less." Jerry was already on his feet and reaching for his coat. "I'll bring in the yearlings from the south pasture and seal up the chicken coop." "I'll seat the windows," Cass said. "Banner, you want me to ride the line fence before it hits?" Banner thought about it. He thought about letting Cass go because Cass was younger and faster on his feet and could cover the ground in half the time. He thought about sitting down at the table and letting the cornbread fill his stomach and the coffee warm his hands and letting the two boys he had raised into men do the work for once while he sat by the stove like an old hound. And then he thought about that whisper. The whisper had not gone away. The whisper was still there at the back of his neck, soft as a moth's wing. "No," he said. "I'll go myself. There's a stretch up by the north gate where I set a couple of wolf traps last week. If the snow covers the plates, any animal that wanders through there tonight is going to lose a leg. I can't have that on my conscience tomorrow." Cass watched him carefully across the kitchen. "You sure, Banner?" "I'm sure." "Then take the rope." Banner nodded. The rope was a thing the three of them had agreed on after a cattleman over in the next valley had frozen to death 2 winters back, not 10 feet from his own front door, because he had walked out into a whiteout without a tether and had lost his bearings between the porch and the barn. Out in this country, a man could die of a mistake that small. The rope was the difference between a mistake and a grave. He tied one end of the long hemp rope around the newel post of the porch and the other end through an iron loop on his belt. He pulled the heavy buffalo hide coat that had belonged to his father up over his ears. He took his Winchester down from its peg above the door, not because he expected to use it, but because a man in this country did not walk into a storm without a rifle any more than he walked into a church without removing his hat. Some things were simply done. Before he stepped off the porch, Jerry came to the door and put a hand on his sleeve. "Be careful out there, Banner." Banner looked down at the boy he had raised from 14 years old. The boy whose father had been gunned down by bank robbers in a dusty Kansas street and who had walked the whole way to Idaho alone with nothing but a rolled blanket and a letter of introduction written in pencil. He put his own gloved hand over the boy's hand for the space of one heartbeat. "I always am, son." Then he stepped off the porch into the rising wind, and the wind closed around him, and 3 minutes later the snow began to fall in earnest, and the world dissolved into white. 3 weeks earlier, and 1,800 miles to the east on the second floor of a narrow brick row house on Beacon Street in Boston, a young woman named Winifred Ashbrook knelt on the bare wood floor of a rented bedroom and folded the last of her earthly possessions into a leather trunk that had once belonged to her grandmother. 3 plain wool dresses washed soft as the petal of an iris, a tortoise-shell comb missing 3 of its teeth, a small daguerreotype of her parents on their wedding day, taken when her mother had been 19 and her father 23. Both of them unsmiling and solemn in the way that people were unsmiling in pictures in those years because they had not yet been told they were allowed to look happy. A sewing kit of fine bone needles and thread in every color a young woman could ever want. $19.60 knotted up tight in a handkerchief that had once been her mother's. And the Ashbrook family Bible, bound in black leather, worn pale at the corners, with the names of all her dead, written in a spidery hand on the front flyleaf going back to 1789. That was everything she owned in the world. Winifred was 22 years old. She had hair the color of dark honey and eyes the color of storm water on a Massachusetts pond. And if a man had passed her on the street in Boston and given her a second look, he would have said she was pretty in the quiet way a hymn is pretty when you hear it through the open door of a church on a summer evening. But no man had ever given her that second look because Winnie Ashbrook had spent the most important years of her life invisible. Her father and mother had both been taken by consumption when she was 15, one after the other inside the same 6 months. And her uncle had taken her in the way a tired farmer takes in a stray cat, which is to say, grudgingly. For 7 long years he had worked her like a servant in the back rooms of his bookbinding shop, and when his own heart had finally given out the previous spring, he had left behind nothing but a stack of unpaid bills and a house that had to be sold to settle them. That was when she had answered the advertisement. She had found it in the back columns of the Matrimonial Herald, and it had been written in a kind, quiet voice that seemed to lift off the page and into the dim attic where she had been reading it by candlelight. Christian gentleman of standing proprietor of a prosperous cattle ranch at the foot of the Sawtooth Range seeks young wife of Quaker or similar faith to share a simple life under God. Travel paid. Right to O. Crenshaw, Silver City, Idaho Territory. She had written the letter that same night with her heart beating fast. And when the answers came back, they were beautiful. They spoke of wheat fields under an enormous sky. They spoke of a small white chapel with a bell that rang on Sunday mornings. They spoke of Proverbs 31 and the virtuous woman whose price was far above rubies. They were signed in a sloping, deliberate hand that looked to Winnie like the hand of a man who had read his Bible every night since he was a small boy. She had read those letters over and over in her uncle's cold attic room, and she had pressed them to her chest, and she had believed with the whole of her heart that the God her mother had taught her about was finally answering a prayer she had been praying since she was 15 years old. And the prayer was the simplest prayer there is. Please, Lord, send me somebody who will not leave me alone. And so she had boarded a train. On the fourth night out of Boston, somewhere in the rolling dark of the Dakota country, where the prairie went on forever like the back of a sleeping animal, Winifred sat in a coach car with her grandmother's trunk at her feet and the family Bible in her lap, and a woman in a black morning dress slid into the seat across from her with a tired sigh. The woman introduced herself as Henrietta Pruitt, the widow of a silver miner out of Butte, returning home to her sister's house after burying her husband in the same ground that had killed him. She had a kind face and weary eyes, and when Winnie, in the polite way young women have of filling silences, mentioned that she was traveling to Silver City to be married to a Mr. Obadiah Crenshaw, the kindness in Henrietta Pruitt's face drained out of it the way water drains out of a cracked pitcher. The widow did not speak for a long, terrible moment. The wheels of the train clacked beneath them. Somewhere in another car a baby cried and was hushed. Finally, Henrietta Pruitt reached across the aisle and took both of Winnie's hands in hers. "Child," she said, and her voice was barely above a whisper, "do you pray often?" "Yes, ma'am, every night." "Then you'll want to pray harder. You'll want to pray harder than you ever have in your life where you are going." Winnie's mouth went dry as straw. "Ma'am, what do you mean?" But Henrietta Pruitt was already shaking her head and looking away as if she had said too much or not nearly enough and could not decide which was the greater sin. "I cannot tell you, child. I cannot speak the things I know. But I will pray for you every single night myself. I will pray every night until I hear that you are safe." At the next stop, the widow stood up without another word and stepped down onto a dark wooden platform and disappeared into the lamplight of a town whose name Winnie never even saw. And Winnie was left alone in her coach seat with her Bible pressed against her ribs and her heart hammering against the leather cover of the book as if it were trying to climb inside the pages for shelter. She could not turn back. She had no money. She had no home to go back to. She closed her eyes and she began to pray. The stagecoach from Helena to Miller's Crossing took 2 more days, and when Winnie finally stepped down from it into the thin gray light of that November afternoon, the wind was already carrying the first scout flakes of snow. Miller's Crossing was not a town. Miller's Crossing was a leaning signpost in a single weather-beaten shed and a watering trough cracked clean down the middle by years of freeze. The stagecoach driver unloaded her trunk with a grunt, tipped his hat, climbed back up onto the box, and was gone inside of 3 minutes. For a little while, Winnie stood there alone with the empty plains stretching off to one side of her and the pine-covered slope of the mountain climbing away to the other. And she told herself that this was a small test of her patience. The letters had promised that Mr. Crenshaw himself would meet her. She would wait. She did not have to wait long. A rider came up the trail from the south at a slow walking pace, and as he approached, Winnie's first thought was that he did not look like a man who had written those letters. He was tall and whip-thin with a black mustache and eyes the color of a river bottom in late summer. His coat was good-cut leather, but it had not been cleaned in a long while, and the spurs on his boots were silver with rowels shaped like 5-pointed stars that caught the gray afternoon light. He drew up his horse in front of her and touched the brim of his flat black hat without smiling. "Miss Ashbrook." "Yes, yes, that is me." Her heart leapt up into her throat. "Are you Mr. Crenshaw?" "No, ma'am, name's Lazarus Kettering. Mr. Crenshaw sent me to fetch you on account of he's laid up with a chest cold today and didn't want to risk the weather." He made a small apologetic gesture with one gloved hand. "He sends his deepest apologies and his warmest welcome." Winnie felt the tension in her shoulders loosen a fraction. A cold. Of course, that was a reasonable thing in November. "Oh, I am sorry to hear he is unwell. Should we make haste?" "Soon enough, ma'am. First, I have to ask you a question or two, if you'll permit it." "Of course." "Mr. Crenshaw asked me to inquire respectfully like about the matter of your dowry." Kettering's voice was perfectly polite, but there was something in his eyes that made Winnie want to take a step back from the horse. "The letters gave him to understand that you were a young woman of some means. He wants to know what arrangements have been made so he can plan the wedding accordingly." Winnie felt her cheeks go hot, and then cold, and then hot again. "Mr. Kettering, I wrote in my very first letter that my uncle had left me nothing. I wrote of my circumstances plainly. Mr. Crenshaw answered that my heart and my faith were more valuable to him than any sum of gold. I have $19 to my name, and everything else I own is in that trunk yonder. I am sorry if there has been some misunderstanding." Something happened to Lazarus Kettering's face then. It happened slowly the way ice forms on a pond at the turning of the year, and it was a terrible thing to watch. The politeness went first, and then the pretense of warmth, and what was left underneath when both of those things were gone was the face of a man who had done bad things to other people for money for a long time and had stopped feeling bad about it years ago. "I see," he said quietly. "I see. Well, that does change the arrangement somewhat." "I do not understand." "No, ma'am, you don't." He glanced up at the sky and read something in it the way another man might read a clock. "Mr. Crenshaw keeps a smaller property for cases such as yours. More modest accommodations. More fitting for a bride of humble means. It is about a mile up that trail there." He pointed with one gloved finger to a narrow path that climbed into the pines and disappeared into the gathering dark. "I'll ride ahead and let him know you are coming. You follow on foot." "On foot, but my trunk." "I'll send a boy down for the trunk tomorrow first thing. 1 mile is nothing, ma'am. A pleasant walk for a young woman of your vigor." He did not wait for her to answer. He touched the brim of his hat one more time. He turned his horse. He rode away up that trail at a clean, easy trot, and he did not look back. Not even when Winnie called after him into the rising wind, and inside of 2 minutes he was lost in the trees, and she was standing alone at Miller's Crossing with a leather trunk at her feet, and the snow beginning to fall in earnest. It took her a long moment to understand that she had been left. It took her another long moment to understand that the trail he had pointed to did not look like the kind of trail that led to any kind of house at all. She had no choice but to walk. The first mile was not so bad. The trail climbed gently through the pines, and Winnie walked with her Bible clutched tight against her chest and her head ducked down against the wind, and she told herself that Mr. Kettering had merely been rude, that the ranch was real, that Mr. Crenshaw was waiting for her at the end of this with a warm fire and a bowl of something hot, and an explanation that would make sense of all of this in the soft yellow light of a lamp. She told herself that God did not answer a prayer with a trick. In the second mile, the snow began to come down in earnest, and the wind came down off the high ridge with teeth in it, and her thin wool coat, which had served her perfectly well on the brick sidewalks of Boston, began to feel like a single layer of paper pressed against her skin. Her leather city shoes, which had been made for parlors and gaslit avenues, soaked through in the first 10 minutes. The first joints of her toes began to burn, and then to numb, and then to disappear from her body altogether the way a candle disappears when the wick burns down to nothing. In the third mile, the trail narrowed and the trees closed in around it, and the light began to fail, and Winifred Ashbrook understood the way a drowning person understands the shape of the shore. She understood that there was no ranch at the end of this path. There was no small white chapel. There was no bell that would ring on Sunday morning. There was no Mr. Crenshaw waiting beside a fire. There was only the storm, and the storm had been sent to kill her, and the man who had sent it was sitting somewhere warm and dry, drinking coffee and counting the seconds. She fell to her knees in the snow. The cold came up through the worn fabric of her dress, and she gasped aloud at the shock of it. And for one terrible moment, she thought perhaps she would simply stay there on her knees, because the effort of standing back up was suddenly more than she could imagine her body being able to perform. The Bible slipped from her numb fingers and dropped into the powder beside her, and she looked down at it, lying there, black leather against perfect white, and she thought very calmly, with the strange, clear calm of a person who has stopped being able to feel their own hands, I am going to be the last name written in that book, and there is no one left in this world to write it down. And then she heard her mother's voice. She heard it as clearly as if her mother were standing right behind her in the storm. She heard her mother say in the same Tennessee accent she had grown up listening to as a small child being put to bed in a brass frame bed in the upstairs of a Boston townhouse. Winnie, baby, you stand up. 3 more steps. That is all your mama's asking. 3 more steps. She did not know if it was an angel or a ghost, or the last flare of a dying mind making promises it could not keep. She did not care. She picked up the Bible. She pressed it back hard against her ribs where it belonged. She got her feet under her and she stood. 3 steps, then 3 more, then 3 more. The wind had become a thing that hit her in the chest and tried to shove her backwards down the mountain like a wrestler. The snow was past her knees in the deeper drifts. She could not feel her feet and she could not feel her hands, and the cold had stopped hurting her, which she dimly remembered was the worst sign of all. But she kept walking because her mother had told her to, because the Bible was pressed against her heart, and her mother's spidery handwriting was still on the flyleaf, and her mother was praying for her somehow from wherever it was that mothers went when consumption took them in their 34th year. And then at last she fell beside a great dark boulder that rose up out of the snow like the shoulder of a buried giant, and this time her legs would not answer her at all. She curled her body around the Bible. She closed her eyes. She whispered into the leather cover of the book the simplest prayer of her life. Lord, if you can hear me, please do not let me die alone out here. Please send somebody, please. Then the cold took her and she did not know anything else. Bannister Whitlock had turned back for home. He had checked the wolf traps and sprung the one that needed springing, and he had worked his way along the line fence for maybe 400 yards with the storm rising around him. And when the visibility dropped to the length of his own outstretched arm, he had decided that enough was enough for any man. He followed the tether rope back through the howling white one cold hand over the other, and he was perhaps 300 feet from his own front porch when something caught at the very edge of his vision and made him stop. A patch of color where no patch of color should have been. The whole world around him was white and gray and the black of pine trunks. But down the slope from the trail, maybe 20 paces off, there was a small spot of faded blue. The blue of a woman's coat that had once been a brighter blue before many washings had taken the color out of it. Banner stood very still on the trail with the rope humming in his right hand. The wind shifted for half a second, and in that half second the blowing snow parted, and in that opening he saw the shape of her clearly. A woman, a young woman by the size of her, curled on her side at the base of a boulder, half buried already in the drifting powder. One arm pressed across her chest like a person trying to keep something safe inside their coat. He did not think. He let the tether rope run out behind him, and he waded down the slope with the snow hissing around his boots, and his heart was hammering inside his rib cage in a way it had not hammered since the war. He dropped to his knees beside her. He rolled her gently onto her back with hands that were careful even in their hurry, because a decade of being a husband had taught Bannister Whitlock how to touch a woman as if she were made of something precious, and that lesson had never quite left his hands, even though the wife who had taught it to him had been gone 11 winters now. Her skin was the color of skimmed milk. Her lips were a blue so dark it was almost black. Her hair was the color of dark honey under the rime of ice that had formed in it, and her right hand was locked around a small black leather book so tightly that her knuckles had gone translucent, the way a candle flame looks when it burns right down close to the wick. Banner pulled off his right glove with his teeth, and he pressed two rough fingers to the hollow of her throat. Nothing. He waited. He waited, and the wind howled around them, and he waited some more. And he thought with the bitter familiarity of a man who has watched too much dying in his life, there it is. There it is, Lord. Another one you could not be bothered to save. And then underneath his fingertips, a single slow beat. Just one. He held his breath. He counted. He had counted pulses before on the fields of Pennsylvania when he was a boy carrying water to wounded men, and he knew how long to wait before you gave up on a body. Another beat. Weaker. She was still in there. Just barely. But she was still in there. Bannister Whitlock, who had not spoken to God in 11 years, who had buried his wife and his unborn son in the same pine box on the hill behind his house, and had stood at that grave with dry eyes and said nothing, because there was nothing he wished to say, found himself kneeling in the snow beside a dying stranger, and he heard words coming out of his own mouth that he had not planned on saying. Lord, I know I do not have the right. I walked away from you the night you took Eliza, and I have not once looked back over my shoulder since. I have nothing to offer you, and no claim on you, and no good reason in this world for you to listen to a single thing I say. But I am asking for this one thing. And if you give me this one thing, I will not ask you for another thing as long as I live. Do not take this one, not today, not like this. The wind took his words and carried them away up into the storm, and Banner did not know whether anyone at all had heard them. But he took off the heavy buffalo hide coat that had been his father's before him, and he wrapped it carefully around the woman on the ground, and he lifted her up against his own chest, and he started back up the slope toward the tether rope and the warm house beyond it. She weighed almost nothing at all. She weighed less than a child. He could feel the brittle bird weight of her through the layers of the coat, and he could feel the small black Bible still pressed between them, because her frozen fingers had not let go of it, even in her unconsciousness. That more than anything else was the thing that undid him as he climbed. That a woman dying alone in an Idaho blizzard had refused to release the one thing she loved. He had known men in the war who let go of everything at the end. He had never known one who held on like that. He found the tether rope. He wrapped his free hand around it. He put one snowshoe in front of the other. The wind shoved him sideways. He went down on one knee and stood back up. He kept walking. Twice more the storm put him on the ground, and twice more he got back up. And each time he held her tighter against his chest, so that whatever warmth was left inside his own body would pass through the buffalo hide and into hers. He whispered to her as he climbed, not because he believed she could hear him, but because his own voice was the only thing left in the world that was not the storm. Stay with me, ma'am. Stay with me just a little while longer now. I do not know who you are. I do not know where you came from, but God Almighty put me in your path for a reason, and I am not letting you go on my watch. You hear me, you hold on. You just hold on. When his boots finally hit the wooden planks of his own porch, he kicked the door so hard that the frame shook, and Cass and Jerry were there in a single instant, and Banner staggered inside, and the sudden warmth of the house hit him like a wall, and he nearly went down to his knees from the suddenness of it. God Almighty, Cass breathed when he saw what was in Banner's arms. Get the bearskin rug in front of the stove, not too close. Jerry, get water boiling and find me every wool blanket in this house. Now, move. They moved. For the rest of that long night, the three men of Iron Hollow Ranch played tug of war with death over the body of a young woman whose name they did not yet know. Cass, who had once helped a neighbor nurse a whole family through the cholera of '84 down in West Texas, was the one who kept them from killing her with their own kindness. Slow, he said, over and over again, his hands moving with the calm authority of a man who had done this work before. Slow, slow, slow. Warm the blankets first, but not too hot. Rub her hands through the wool. Do not touch her skin directly. Not yet. If we warm her too fast, her heart will stop right here in this room. Do you hear me, Banner Slow? Jerry kept the stove fed and the water moving, and at one point he fetched down an old sheepskin that had belonged to Banner's mother, brought west in a wagon 30 years ago, and laid it under her body for extra insulation between her and the cold floor. Banner did the part that only a man who had been a husband could do. With the skinning knife he carried on his belt, and with eyes that did not linger for even a fraction of a second, he cut away the frozen ruin of her city dress, which would have killed her by morning if it had stayed on her body, and he left her in the dry woolen undergarments beneath, and then he wrapped her in 5 careful layers of warm blanket, the way a mother swaddles a newborn. He never once looked at her body except as a problem to be solved. Eliza had taught him long ago that a woman was not a thing to be seen. A woman was a soul to be tended. They worked through the small hours of the night. The wind screamed against the log walls. The cast iron stove glowed orange in the darkened room. Around midnight, her color began to change, and the fever came on hard, and she began to moan softly, a sound like grief and relief mixed together. The sound a person makes when the feeling comes back into their nerves and the pain comes with it. Her eyes fluttered behind her lids but did not open. She began to whisper. The whispers were fragments at first, and none of them made any sense to the 3 men gathered around her on the bearskin rug. The trail, only a mile. Mother, the Lord is my shepherd. I shall not want. Jerry, who knew his Bible because the schoolmaster in Helena had made every boy in the territory memorize it before they could draw their school certificate, looked up sharply across the lamplight. That is the 23rd Psalm, Banner. She is praying. Bannister Whitlock looked down at the young woman on the bearskin rug and felt something shift inside his chest that he did not have a name for. He reached over to the small table by the stove where he had laid the black leather Bible when he first brought her inside. He picked it up carefully the way a man picks up a thing that belongs to someone else, and he placed it gently on her chest, just under her folded hands where it had been when he found her. Her fingers closed around it at once, even in her unconsciousness, and her breathing steadied. Banner Whitlock sat back on his heels and looked across at his 2 brothers in the lamplight, and none of the 3 of them said a single word. Around the darkest hour of that long night, when even the wind outside had grown tired, and the storm had settled into a long, steady moan against the eaves, Banner was sitting alone on the floor beside her, with a cool, damp cloth in his right hand, pressing it gently against her forehead to bring the fever down. Cass had gone to lie down for an hour. Jerry was asleep in the chair by the door, his chin dropped onto his chest. Without warning, her eyes opened. They were the clearest gray he had ever seen, the color of morning sky after a long rain has finally washed the world clean, and they looked directly into his with a strange, impossible focus, as if she had been waiting her whole life to look at him. And now that she was finally doing it, she did not intend to waste a single second of the looking. "My mother," she whispered. Her voice was thin as a thread, but it was perfectly clear. "My mother prayed for a man with eyes like yours to come and find me. You are him. I knew you by my heart before I ever saw you with my eyes." Then her own eyes closed again, and she was gone back into the fever. Bannister Whitlock sat very still on the bearskin rug beside her. The damp cloth was forgotten in his hand. The stove hissed softly behind him. And for the first time in 11 years, something in the stone wall he had built around his own heart shifted, and a hairline crack opened along an old fault line, and a small warmth began to come through. He did not know what to call what he was feeling. He had not felt it in so many years that he had forgotten it even had a name. He only knew that he had made a promise out there in the snow beside that boulder that he would not let her go, and he knew sitting there in the dark with her Bible rising and falling on her chest with each fragile breath that the promise he had made had just become something far larger than a promise. It had become an oath. And a man of Iron Hollow Ranch did not break an oath. Not ever. Not even when it cost him everything he had. She slept the rest of that long night, and the storm outside slept with her. And high above the Sawtooth Peaks, the wind began at last to slacken, and somewhere far away in the valley below, in a town called Silver City, a fat man in a black overcoat was just then leaning across a polished oak table in the back room of a saloon, listening to a tall, whip-thin man with a black mustache and a pair of star-shaped silver spurs deliver a piece of news that the fat man did not want to hear. But Banner Whitlock did not know about that conversation yet. He only knew that the woman on the bearskin rug was still breathing. He only knew that for the first time in 11 Idaho winters, the house at the end of the valley was not empty. By mid-morning of the next day, the storm had broken clean across the Sawtooth Range. The whole of the valley lay under 3 feet of fresh powder, and the sun came up over the eastern ridge and turned the snowfield into a glare so bright it hurt a man's eyes to look at directly. Bannister Whitlock sat at the long pine table cleaning his Winchester out of old habit while he watched her on the bearskin rug, and at 10:15, her breathing changed in a way he had been waiting for. And a few minutes after that, her eyes opened for the second time, and this time they stayed open. She took in the low beam ceiling above her. She took in the bundles of dried sage and yarrow hanging from the rafters. She took in the cast iron stove and the bear skin rug and the wool blanket she was wrapped in, and the oversized flannel shirt she realized with a slow flush of color that someone had dressed her in. Her eyes moved to the 3 men in the room. Cass by the front window with his arms folded, Jerry at the wash basin in his stocking feet, and Banner at the table with the long rifle in his hands. Her face went pale with a terror so complete that Banner set the Winchester down at once on the table, and he raised his hands slowly the way a man raises his hands to a frightened animal he does not want to spook. "Easy now, ma'am. Easy. You are safe in this house. I give you my word as a man. You are safe." She tried to speak. Her throat was too raw to make a sound. Jerry crossed the room in his stocking feet and brought her a tin cup of warm broth and held it for her while she sipped. And Banner watched the gentleness in the boy's hands and felt a flicker of pride that had no place in a moment like this. "My name is Bannister Whitlock," he said, keeping his voice low and even, the way a man speaks to a horse that has bolted once and might bolt again. "This is my ranch, Iron Hollow. We sit at the foot of the Sawtooth Range up a valley folks around here call Dead Man's Gulch, on account of a wagon party that lost itself here back in '59. These are my brothers, Cassius Redfern from East Texas and Jericho Hadley from Kansas. We are the only 3 souls on this mountain for 10 miles in any direction." He paused and let her take that in. "I found you yesterday afternoon in the blizzard, ma'am, beside a boulder about 300 yards from this front door. You were dying. I brought you inside. We have been working to keep you in the world ever since." He watched her carefully as she absorbed this. "I had to cut away your dress, ma'am. It was frozen solid and it would have killed you by morning. I did not look. I want you to hear that from my own mouth before another hour goes by. I did not look once. I have been a husband in my time, and I know how a man treats a woman who is in trouble. You have my word before God on that. And out in this country, a man's word is the only thing he owns that nobody can take from him." She swallowed. Her eyes filled with tears that did not fall. "Thank you, Mr. Whitlock. May I ask your names again, all 3 of you, so I might know who has saved my life?" They told her again slower this time, and she nodded each name into her memory. "And how did a young woman come to be lying in a snowdrift on my mountain, ma'am?" So Winnie Ashbrook, in a voice that shook, and with the family Bible still clutched against her chest under the woolen blankets, told them. She told them about the advertisement in the Matrimonial Herald. She told them about the letters and the Proverbs 31, and the small white chapel, and the Christian gentleman who had signed his name O'Crenshaw. She told them about her uncle and the $19, and the long train ride west, and the widow in the black mourning dress who had whispered to her to pray harder than she ever had in her life. She told them about Lazarus Kettering at Miller's Crossing in the silver star-shaped spurs, and the way his politeness had drained out of his face like water out of a broken pitcher when she had said she had no dowry. She told them about being pointed up a trail that did not lead to any kind of house at all. She told them about the 3 miles in the storm. She told them about her mother's voice asking her for 3 more steps. She told them about falling at last beside the boulder and about praying for someone to come. As she spoke, the faces of the 3 men of Iron Hollow Ranch went through a series of changes that Winifred Ashbrook would remember for the rest of her life. Cass Redfern's jaw went tight. His big, weathered hand closed slowly into a fist on the edge of the table, and at one point he said a word under his breath that was not the kind of word a man said in front of a lady, and then he flushed all the way to the roots of his sandy hair and apologized so sincerely that Winnie almost smiled into her broth. Jerry Hadley went as white as the snow outside the window because Jerry had grown up in the rough towns of Kansas, and he had known men like Lazarus Kettering as a boy, and he knew exactly what star-shaped silver spurs meant on a man's boots in this country. He looked across the room at Banner with eyes that said, "Please tell her. Please tell her now." Banner Whitlock listened the whole way through without interrupting. Only when she reached the part about the boulder did a single muscle feather along the line of his jaw, and only his two brothers knew him well enough to see it. When Winnie was done speaking, the cabin was very quiet. Banner stood up slowly from the table. He walked across the floor to the bearskin rug where she lay, and he knelt down beside her so that their eyes were level. He did not take her hand because he knew he did not yet have the right. But his voice when he finally spoke was the gentlest she had ever heard from a grown man in her life. "Miss Ashbrook, I need you to hear me now, and I need you to hear me clear, because what I am about to say is a hard thing and a true thing, and you deserve both. There is no ranch at the end of that trail. There never was. Obadiah Crenshaw does not own a single head of cattle. He owns 3 saloons in Silver City and a gambling hall, and he runs the whole rotten underside of this territory from the back room of a place called the Black Dog. The women who work in his houses did not go there willingly. He preys on women like you, women without family, women who would not be missed, women with faith in their hearts and no one to protect them." He paused. He let the words settle. "He did not abandon you at Miller's Crossing, ma'am. That was not abandonment. That was murder. He sent Lazarus Kettering, who has killed more men than my brothers are old, and he pointed you up a trail in the dying light of a November afternoon with a blizzard coming down off the ridge. And he left you to freeze. It was cheaper and cleaner than using a bullet. He was letting the mountain do his killing for him." Winifred Ashbrook began to weep. She wept silently at first, the way a person weeps when they have been taught all their life that tears are a private thing to be saved for empty rooms. Then, as the full weight of what she had just been told settled down onto her shoulders, the tears became something harder. She pressed the Bible against her face, and her shoulders shook, and the sound she made was the sound of every prayer she had ever prayed, breaking in half inside her chest. "I was a fool," she whispered into the worn leather. "I believed every word of it. I thought God was answering me." "Miss Ashbrook." Banner waited until she looked up at him through her tears. When she did, his eyes had changed. They were still hard. They would always be hard because the war and the death of his wife had written themselves into the bones of his face, and they were not going away. But there was something else in them now. Something that had not been there yesterday morning when he had stood in the yard watching a purple sky come in over the peaks. "You are not a fool. A fool is a person who knows better and chooses wrong. You are a young woman of faith who was preyed upon by a wicked man. There is a world of difference between those two things, and I will not have you confusing them under my roof. And as long as you are under my roof, Miss Ashbrook, you are under my protection. That is not a polite thing I am saying to comfort you. That is an oath. And out in this country, an oath from a man of Iron Hollow is not a thing that breaks." Behind him, Cass took one slow step forward and laid his big weathered hand on the back of Banner's shoulder. "His oath is our oath, ma'am." Jerry Hadley nodded once solemnly from across the room. "That is how it works out here, Miss Ashbrook." Winifred Ashbrook looked at the 3 of them. These 3 strangers who 12 hours ago had not known her name, and something inside her, something that had been locked shut and cold since the morning her mother had died. In 1881 began very slowly to thaw. It was not love yet. It was not even trust yet. It was only the first whisper of the thing that comes before those things. It was the moment when a person who has been alone their entire life looks up and realizes with a shock that goes all the way down into the marrow that they are not alone anymore. She whispered thank you, and then she could not say anything else. Banner, understanding, stood up and gave her the mercy of privacy. He walked to the front door and pulled on his coat and said to his brothers without turning around, "I am going back out to the boulder. I want to see if I can salvage her trunk before the wind buries it any deeper." Cass glanced up at him. You sure snow is waist deep out there now? I am sure. The truth was, Banner Whitlock needed the air. He needed to stand outside for a few minutes and breathe the cold and feel the mountain around him, because the thing that had just happened inside the cabin was too large to sit still with all at once. A woman had told him she had known him by her heart before she saw him with her eyes, and he had sworn an oath over her to a God he had not spoken to in 11 years. And both of those things had reorganized something fundamental inside his chest, and he needed a few quiet minutes alone to figure out how to carry them. He strapped on his snowshoes. He took the Winchester. He retraced his own steps from the day before, following the half-buried trail of his own passing, and after about a quarter of an hour, he came back to the great dark boulder where he had found her. The trunk was still there, mostly buried on its side against the base of the rock. Banner bent down and began brushing snow off the leather lid, and that was when his eyes, which had been trained by 20 years of tracking to notice the things that did not belong, caught something on the leeward side of the boulder that made his whole body go very still. Boot prints. Not the sweeping shapes of drifts, not the smooth shapes of wind sculpting itself against stone. Boot prints. Deep cylindrical holes punched clean through the hard crust, sheltered from the worst of the wind by the shoulder of the rock itself. They had been made yesterday, probably within the hour of when he had first found Winnie lying there. Banner knelt down slowly in the snow and brushed the powder away with the back of his glove, and the outline came up clean and sharp underneath. A heavy riding boot, and on the heel, pressed deep into the frozen ground beneath the powder, the unmistakable gouge of a spur rowel shaped like a five-pointed star. He studied the angle of the tracks for a long moment. Whoever had made them had come up the valley trail from the direction of Miller's Crossing on foot. He had walked right up to the back of this boulder. He had stood here in this exact spot for what looked like a long while, his weight shifting from one foot to the other, the way a man's weight shifts when he is waiting on something. And then he had turned around and gone back down the mountain the way he had come. Banner's mind put the pieces together the way a mind always does when it is looking at something it does not want to see. Winnie had said that Lazarus Kettering rode away from her at Miller's Crossing. She had said it plainly, but these tracks said something else entirely. These tracks said that Kettering had not ridden away at all, or that he had ridden a little ways up the road and then circled back on foot. He had followed her up this trail at a careful distance through the gathering storm. He had watched her fall here beside this boulder. He had stood behind this rock just out of her sight with his hat pulled low against the wind, and he had waited, not lifting a single finger to help her, making absolutely certain she did not get back up. And when he had finally turned and walked back down the mountain, it had not been because he was satisfied that she was dying. It had been because Banner himself had come out of the cabin into the storm, and Kettering had heard the dog of the rope snap somewhere up the slope, and Kettering had decided to leave before he was seen. Which meant that Lazarus Kettering at this exact moment was sitting somewhere down in Silver City across a polished oak table from Obadiah Crenshaw, and he was telling the fat man that the girl from Boston had not died alone in the snow the way she was supposed to. He was telling him that the rancher up at Iron Hollow had come out into the blizzard and carried her inside through the front door. He was telling him that she was still alive. Bannister Whitlock stood up slowly beside the boulder with the star-shaped boot print at his feet and the Winchester in his hands, and he looked down the long white valley toward Silver City, invisible beyond the ridges, but very real, and he spoke into the cold air in a voice so quiet that only the wind could hear him. So that is how it is going to be, Crenshaw. You sent the devil up my mountain to kill a woman who prays. Well, you have made yourself a mistake, because the devil you sent did not finish the job, and the woman he was sent to kill is lying inside my house right now with her mother's Bible on her chest and my oath over her head. You are going to come for her. I know that because I would come for her too if I were the kind of man you are. Men like you cannot leave a witness walking. He paused, and the wind paused with him. So come on then. Come up this mountain. Bring whatever you have got. Bring Kettering and bring the rest of your hired dogs and bring every gun you can buy in Silver City. But when you cross that tree line down at the bottom of the valley, you are going to be crossing it onto Iron Hollow land. And on Iron Hollow land, there are three brothers in one oath and a woman whose faith I am starting to believe in, even though I spent 11 years telling myself that faith was a thing for other men. He slung the trunk strap over his shoulder. He turned his back on the valley. He started the long walk home through the snow. Above him, the sun cleared the high ridge of the Sawtooth and lit up the whole world in a cold silver light. And somewhere in the trees behind him, a single crow called once and went silent, and Bannister Whitlock did not look back. The morning after Banner came home from the boulder with the news of the star-shaped boot prints, the three men of Iron Hollow Ranch sat around the pine table and held the kind of conversation that men hold when they know the world is about to come for them and they cannot yet tell their woman. Winnie was asleep behind the closed door of the small back bedroom that Banner had given up to her without a second thought. The fever had finally broken in the small hours, and Jerry had checked on her twice already that morning, moving on his stocking feet so as not to wake her. And each time he had come back to the main room and nodded once to say she was still breathing and still asleep. Banner laid out what he had seen in the snow. He did not raise his voice. Bannister Whitlock almost never raised his voice. And when he did, the men around him knew that blood was about to follow. But this morning his voice was low and steady, the way the voice of a man sounds when he has already stopped being surprised by the wickedness of other men and is only thinking now about what to do about it. Kettering followed her up the mountain. He watched her fall. He stood behind that boulder and waited on her to die. That is the kind of man we are dealing with. Not a hired gun who takes his money and walks away. A hired gun who stays and watches because he was told to be sure. Which means that when he went back down the mountain, he did not tell Obadiah Crenshaw that he had left her at Miller's Crossing and the storm had taken her. He told him he had walked her up a trail and waited until I came out of the cabin and scared him off. Crenshaw knows right now as we sit here drinking this coffee that she is alive. He knows she is in this house, and he knows that I know who he is because she will have told me everything, and he knows I will have believed her. Cass folded his arms across the table. So he is coming. He is coming. Banner looked toward the window where the bright silver glare of the snowfield lay a foot and a half deep across the yard. Not today, not this week, not even this month if we are lucky. The pass at Horse Prairie is already choked. No rider is getting over that in anything less than 4 feet of snowshoes. And a man on snowshoes cannot carry enough gun to be worth the trip. As long as the snow holds, we have time. The thing we need to watch for is a Chinook, the warm wind. If that comes down off the ridge and eats the pack in a day, the trail opens back up and we will have riders at our door before we have finished morning coffee. Jerry spoke up quietly from the end of the table. And if we had any sense at all, we would put her in a wagon and take her to Helena ourselves before the Chinook comes. Tell the federal marshal the whole story. Let the law handle Crenshaw. I thought of that already, Banner said. And the federal marshal in Helena is a good man. His name is Ezra Locke, and I have known him 15 years. But Helena is 3 days from here in good weather, and we do not have good weather. Also, Jerry Crenshaw owns the sheriff of Silver City. He owns 2 of the 3 judges in the valley. If he decides to file a piece of paper on her, any paper at all, we would not get halfway down the mountain before someone with a badge stopped us and took her off our hands. And once she is off our hands, we are never seeing her again in this life. He paused. No, she stays here. On this land she is ours to protect. Anywhere else she is theirs to take. Cass nodded slowly. Then we fort up. We fort up. And we do it carefully so she does not see what we are doing until she is strong enough to carry the knowledge. She has been through the hell of her life in the last 72 hours. She does not need to wake up this morning and be told that a gang of men with guns is going to come up this mountain to finish what Kettering started. Not yet. Not until she can stand on her own 2 feet without the room tilting. How long do we give her? Banner thought about it. 2 weeks. 2 weeks of quiet. 2 weeks of being allowed to be a person instead of a problem. Then we tell her the rest of it. We tell her because she deserves to know, and because when the day finally comes, we are going to need her to be able to hold a gun herself. Jerry's face went still. You think it is going to come to that, Banner? I think a woman who walked 3 miles up an Idaho trail in a blizzard with nothing but a Bible and her mother's voice in her ear is a woman who knows how to stand her ground. And I think we are going to need her standing when the time comes. He pushed his chair back and walked to the peg by the door and took down his coat. One more thing. As long as she is in this house, there are rules. No one is alone with her except to bring her food or tend to her if she calls out. No one speaks a word in her hearing that we would not speak in the hearing of our own mother. She sleeps behind a bolted door. There is a small Colt on the shelf in her room loaded, and she is to be told where it is the first day she is able to walk that far. And if any of you, even for a single moment, forget what a woman like her is worth in this country, I will remind you with my own two hands. Is that understood? Understood, Cass said. Jerry said nothing at all because Jerry did not need to be told. Jerry had grown up in the houses of other people's families after his father had died, and he had seen up close before his eyes were old enough to look away what happened to girls who had nobody to speak for them. Whatever code of the West there was in this house, Jerry Hadley had written half of it himself without anyone ever noticing. Banner opened the door and stepped out into the cold white morning to go and feed the mules. And behind him at the table, the two younger men sat with their coffee cooling in their cups. Winnie woke that afternoon to the smell of bread baking and the sound of a man humming. For one slow moment, she could not remember where she was, and then she remembered all of it at once. The boulder and the storm and her mother's voice, and the stranger kneeling over her in the snow. And she lay very still under the wool blankets and listened to the humming and tried to understand what she was hearing. It was Cass in the main room. He was humming a slow East Texas song that his own mother had sung to him before she died of a fever in 1867. And he was turning a pan of cornbread in the oven of the cast iron stove. And he was doing it with the careful domestic attention of a man who had learned to cook because nobody else would do it for him. He did not know she was awake. He was humming to himself, and he was humming well. And the sound of it was the sound of a home. Winifred Ashbrook closed her eyes again, and she began very quietly to cry. She did not cry because she was sad. She cried because in the narrow attic room on her uncle's bookbinding shop, where she had been kept for 7 long years, she had not once in all that time heard a man hum. She had not heard a man cook. She had not heard a man speak her name gently or set a tin cup of broth down beside her pillow or close a door softly so as not to wake her. She had lived in a world in which men were strangers, and the only voices in her life had been the voices of unkind women and the voices in her Bible. And now she was lying in a small wooden room on a mountain 2,000 miles away from Boston, and a Texas cowboy was humming a lullaby over a pan of cornbread. She wrapped one of the blankets around her shoulders like a shawl. She opened the door of the small room. Cass turned at the sound. "Miss Ashbrook, you're up." "Mr. Redfern, I think. Is that right?" "Cass will do, ma'am. Mr. Redfern was my father, and I never met the man." He said it lightly, the way a man says a thing that used to hurt but does not hurt anymore. He set a cloth over the cornbread and came around the stove. "Let me help you to the chair by the window. You should not be standing on those feet yet." He did not touch her. He walked beside her with his hand hovering close to her elbow in case she fell, and she thought to herself that this was a man who had been taught somewhere along the way how to be careful with a woman who had been hurt. She sat in the wooden chair by the window, and Cass pulled another blanket over her knees, and she looked out through the frosted glass at the yard of Iron Hollow Ranch for the first time in the daylight. What she saw looked like a painting. 3 feet of untouched snow lay across the yard, sculpted into long blue shadows by the late afternoon sun. A split rail fence ran along the edge of it. A barn and a lean-to and a chicken coop, all wearing thick white caps of powder. Beyond the fence, a long slope of blue spruce climbed up toward a pass that was lost in a haze of cold light. And beyond the pass, the sawtooth peaks rose up in jagged gray teeth against a pale sky. In the middle of the yard, a man was pitching hay to 2 mules from the door of the lean-to. And even at this distance, Winnie knew who it was because there was only one man on this ranch who moved the way he did. Bannister Whitlock worked with the steady economy of a man who had done the same work 10,000 times. He did not waste a single motion. He threw the hay in turn and came back and threw again. And between each throw, he looked up at the sky for half a second, reading it the way another man might read a newspaper. Cass came and stood behind her chair. "He is a good man, ma'am. I know he does not look like it at first. Looks like the kind of man you would not want to meet on a dark road. But I have ridden with him for 9 winters, and I have slept under his roof every one of them, and I have never once seen him do a wrong thing to a person who did not have it coming. He has a hole in him where his wife used to be, Eliza. 11 years this coming February. He has not been the same man since." Winnie did not turn her head. She kept her eyes on the man in the yard. "He knelt down beside me in the snow," she said softly, "and I thought he was an angel. I think I still do." Cass put his big hand on the back of her chair for a brief moment. Then he went back to the stove to check his cornbread and started humming his East Texas song again. And outside in the yard, Banner threw the last of the hay into the lean-to and turned toward the house, and Winnie watched him come, and she understood for the first time that she was not going to leave this place. Over the next 2 weeks, Winifred Ashbrook began the slow work of learning how to belong somewhere. She started by belonging to the kitchen. Jerry brought the flour and the lard up from the root cellar without being asked, and Winnie, once her feet could bear her weight for more than a few minutes at a stretch, began to turn the rough bachelor food of the ranch into something that could rightly be called cooking. She made biscuits with crisp, golden tops. She made a stew of dried venison and onion and wild sage that Cass declared with tears in his eyes that he tried very hard to pretend were from the pepper, to be the first real meal he had eaten since his mother died when he was 9 years old. She made a pie out of dried apples and brown sugar in a crust so thin and flaky that Bannister Whitlock, who had not eaten a slice of pie in 11 years because the last pie he had eaten had been baked by Eliza, took his first bite of it, standing at the kitchen counter, and had to turn his face away from the room for a long moment before he could trust himself to speak again. She did not only cook, she mended the torn elbows of every shirt in the house with stitches so small you could not see them without holding the fabric up to the lamp. She washed and hung out every blanket on the place, and the next time Jerry went to sleep under his quilts, he smelled the ghost of pine soap and high country sunlight. And for the first time in years of ranch bachelorhood, he thought to himself, this is what a home is supposed to smell like. But the thing she brought into the house that mattered most was a thing none of them had realized was missing. She brought in the presence of a decent woman. Within a week, the 3 men of Iron Hollow Ranch had begun to behave differently. Banner wiped his boots on the mat before he came inside every single time. Cass stopped swearing almost entirely, and when he did slip up and use a word he should not have used, he blushed to the roots of his sandy hair and apologized so sincerely that Winnie had to hide her smile in her apron. Jerry began to shave every morning, which was something the others teased him about gently, until they noticed that Cass had started shaving every other morning too. And then Banner started polishing his boots on Sunday evenings. One night a week and a half into her stay, Cass caught all 3 of them at it. Banner oiling his boots at the hearth, Jerry combing his hair in the small shaving mirror by the wash basin, himself fixing a torn cuff on his best shirt by the lamplight. He started to laugh out loud and could not stop. Look at us, 3 wild dogs learning how to sit in a parlor. Banner looked up from his boots and the corner of his mouth twitched upward maybe 1/8 of an inch. That is because it is not the same ranch. Winnie, who was sitting in the rocking chair by the stove with her Bible open on her lap, heard the exchange and did not look up, but her cheeks went a little pink. A few nights later, the thing happened that cracked the last wall in Banner Whitlock's chest. Winnie had finished the supper dishes, and she had taken her usual place in the wooden rocking chair by the fire, and she had opened the Ashbrook family Bible on her lap the way she did every evening at this time. She had not yet read aloud in this house. She had read only to herself, moving her lips over the words the way she had done her whole life. But that evening, Jerry finally gathered his courage and asked, "Miss Winnie, I was wondering, could you read that out loud tonight? My mother used to read the Bible to me on Sunday evenings when I was a little boy before she died, and I have forgotten what the words sound like in a woman's voice." Winnie looked up in surprise. "Of course, if it would please you." Cass set down the bridle he had been polishing and pulled up a stool near the fire. Banner, who had been cleaning the Winchester at the table, went very still, but he did not move from his chair. Winnie turned the pages carefully. She knew what she wanted to read. She had known from the moment Jerry asked. She began the 23rd Psalm. Her voice was soft at first, and then found its footing the way a singer's voice does, and the words came into the room one at a time, and they sat down among the three men like old friends who had been waiting outside in the cold for a long time. Cass closed his eyes and leaned his head back against the wall and let the words wash over him. And for a moment, he was 9 years old again, in a one-room cabin in East Texas, and his mother's voice was coming down to him out of the dark over his bed, and he did not yet have to be a grown man with a gun on his hip and a ranch to defend. At the table, Banner Whitlock set down the oilcloth. He did not pick it up again. Winnie's voice carried on gentle as river water over stone, and when she reached the line about walking through the valley of the shadow of death and fearing no evil, the chair scraped back so fast that she almost stopped reading. Banner stood up. He walked past the fire without a word and out the front door onto the porch and into the cold black night. The door swung shut behind him, and the three people left inside the cabin sat in a silence that was not awkward, but only very full. Winnie looked from the closed door to Jerry. Jerry spoke very quietly. That was the verse his best friend whispered to him while he was dying on the field at Gettysburg, ma'am. Banner was a drummer boy for the 4th Michigan Infantry. He was only 15 years old. The boy died before he could finish the psalm. Banner has not been able to sit through that one being read since. Winnie closed the book gently. Will you two forgive me if I step outside for a moment? She wrapped a wool blanket over her shoulders and picked up a tin cup that she filled with hot coffee from the pot on the stove, and she went out onto the porch. Bannister Whitlock was standing with his hands gripping the porch rail and his back to the door, looking up at a sky so thick with stars it did not look real. His breath came out in slow white clouds. He did not turn around when the door opened. I thought I could listen to it, he said without looking at her. I thought 11 years was long enough that I could sit in a room while a woman read that psalm and not have to walk out. 11 years is not very long, Mr. Whitlock. Not for a thing like that. He turned then. His eyes caught the starlight in a way that made him look younger than he had looked the day before, and Winnie held out the tin cup of coffee. He took it slowly. Thank you. May I sit with you a little while? Yes. They sat down on the bench along the porch rail, and they did not speak for a long stretch of time, and the mules down in the lean-to shifted in their stalls, and one of them coughed the deep, easy cough of an animal at rest. Somewhere far up the slope, a great horned owl called twice, and was answered by another one even further away. After a while, Banner began to talk. He talked about the wheat field at Gettysburg. He told her about a boy from his own regiment, 16 years old, who had taken a ball to the belly in the first hour of the second day, and how that boy had lain in the shade of a split-rail fence for the whole rest of the afternoon with young Banner holding his hand, and how at the very end that boy had whispered the 23rd Psalm all the way through to the line about the valley of the shadow, and had not been able to finish it because the shadow had reached him before the words did. He told her about coming home from the war to a Michigan farmhouse and finding that his parents had both died of typhoid while he was away. He told her about the long road west to Idaho and the 3 years he had spent building Iron Hollow Ranch with his own 2 hands, one log at a time. He told her about Eliza Wheatley, the daughter of a Helena storekeeper, and about meeting her at a church picnic, and about marrying her 4 months later, and about the 2 good years, and about the February night when Eliza had died in childbirth in the back bedroom at the end of the hall with the midwife crying in the kitchen and the baby boy silent in his arms. I told the God of my childhood that I was done, Banner said, his voice very even. I said it the way a man tells a debt collector he does not have the money. I said I am done, and I do not have anything left to give you. And then I came back from Helena, and I buried my wife and my son in the same pine box up on the hill behind the house. And I did not speak a word of prayer over that grave because I did not have any prayers left in me. He paused. And then he told her the part he had never told anyone outside the family. How 6 months after Eliza died, he had found Cass at a train station in Billings, a 21-year-old orphan from East Texas who was fighting three grown men over a loaf of bread, and how Banner had walked into the middle of that fight and pulled the boy out by the collar and put him on a horse and brought him home. And how 2 years after that, a 14-year-old boy had shown up at the front gate of Iron Hollow Ranch in a cold rain, soaking wet, holding a letter of introduction written in pencil saying his name was Jericho Hadley, and his father had been killed by bank robbers in Dodge City, and he had walked from Kansas to Idaho looking for honest work, and would Mr. Whitlock please give him a chance? I could not refuse that boy, Banner said. I did not have it in me, and when I put a roof over his head and food in his belly and a rifle in his hands and taught him how to work a piece of land, I told myself I was just being practical. I told myself I needed the help. But the truth, Miss Ashbrook, is that I was building myself a family out of the wreckage, and I did not know I was doing it until you walked in here and showed me what I had been building all along. Winnie was quiet for a while after he finished. Then she reached across the bench and put her hand over his, very lightly, just for a moment. Mr. Whitlock, you say you lost your faith, but you took in two boys who had nowhere to go. You built them into men. You fed them and clothed them and taught them how to shoot a rifle and how to cut a straight furrow and how to treat a stranger who comes to your door in the snow. That is the work of God, whether you called him by his name while you did it or not. Faith is not always a thing a person says out loud. Sometimes faith is what your hands do when your mouth has stopped speaking. He looked at her then, and for a moment he did not look like a man who had just walked out of a room at the sound of a psalm. He looked like a man who had just been given permission to come back inside. Miss Ashbrook, I would be much obliged if you would call me Banner. Only if you will call me Winnie. All right then, Winnie. He said her name as if he were tasting it, as if it were a word he had never said out loud before in his life. And in a way it was. After another long silence, he said quietly, I would like you to read the rest of that psalm to me some night when you are willing. I would like to hear how it ends. I have not heard how it ends since that boy at Gettysburg could not finish it. I will read it for you, Banner, whenever you are ready. They sat there a little while longer under the cold Idaho stars, and when the bite of the night finally drove them back inside, he held the door open for her with the quiet courtesy of a man who remembered how to be a husband and was only now realizing that he had not forgotten after all. 2 days later, Banner told Cass to teach her how to shoot. He did not do it himself, and Winnie noticed that, and she understood without needing to be told. Banner was not the kind of man who could stand close behind a woman and put his hands on her hands to adjust her grip on a Colt revolver without it becoming a thing his heart could not carry just yet. Cass was the fastest shot of the three of them anyway, and Cass had the easy, light way about him that could turn a frightening lesson into something a woman could laugh about. And Cass, above all, was a man who knew exactly how far to stand from a woman who had been hurt. He set up tin cans on the tops of a row of stumps out past the lean to 15 paces back. And he put an unloaded Colt peacemaker into her hands first, and he walked her through the grip and the stance and the breathing. You want to breathe out, Miss Winnie, not hold your breath. Holding your breath makes the barrel jump. Breathe out slow, and somewhere in the middle of that breath you touch the trigger. You do not pull it, you touch it the way you would touch a hot stove, and then the gun does the rest. Where did you learn to shoot, Cass? He smiled a crooked smile. Same way a lot of Texas boys learn, ma'am. On my own. I was 12 years old, and I had a 6-shooter my uncle left me in a barn wall full of knotholes to shoot at. I missed maybe 1,000 shots before I hit my first one. Cost me all the pocket money I had in powder and lead. But when I finally did hit a knothole clean through, I stood there with the gun still smoking, and I knew right then I was going to be all right in this world. That was the day I figured out I could take care of myself. He paused. And I am telling you that, ma'am, because I want you to know that the feeling you get the first time you hit what you are aiming at is a feeling you should get to have. He loaded the Colt and handed it back to her. Her first shot went wide and kicked up a spray of snow 10 feet past the target. Her second went high. Her third and fourth were closer. She bit her lip. Cass simply stood with his arms folded and let her find it. Her 11th shot hit the middle can dead center, and the can leaped off the stump and spun in the air and landed in the snow 6 feet away. Winnie stared at it. Then she turned to Cass with her gray eyes bright and her mouth open in a small amazed circle, and Cassius Redfern, 31-year-old cowboy who had once ridden shotgun for Wells Fargo and pulled a gun on 7 different men in the course of his life, and had never in any of those occasions felt the way he felt. Right then grinned at her the way an older brother grins at a little sister, and said, "Miss Winnie, you are the best student I ever had." "And how many students have you had, Cass?" "You are my only one, ma'am, but you are still the best." She laughed, and the sound of her laughter on the cold air behind the ranch house was a sound that Iron Hollow Ranch had not heard in a very long time. And somewhere around the side of the barn, Banner Whitlock, who had been pretending very hard to be busy with a piece of harness, stopped pretending and listened and closed his eyes for a moment. On the morning of the 15th day since the blizzard, Jerry went out to the well to draw water and found a large black bird sitting on the top rail of the split-rail fence, staring at him with a flat yellow eye. It was a crow. That by itself was not unusual. What was unusual was that this crow did not fly when Jerry approached. It simply sat there watching him, and on one of its scaled black legs was tied a small strip of red cloth. Jerry's blood went cold inside him. He had grown up in Kansas, and he knew exactly what a tame crow with a red strip on its leg meant out here in the high country. In country where there were no telegraph lines and no reliable postman outlaw outfits passed their messages by trained bird. A red strip meant urgent. A red strip meant a man somewhere down in the valley had paid a boy to send word up the mountain, and the word was for whoever was listening. Jerry approached the bird slowly with his gloved hand held out. The crow did not move. It had been trained to wait. He closed his fingers gently around its body, and the bird submitted without any protest at all, and Jerry carried it back toward the house, and by the time he reached the porch, his hands were shaking. He went inside and set the crow down on the table in front of Banner. Banner looked at it. Then he looked at the red strip. Then he looked at Jerry. "Go get Cass." Cass came in from the barn. The 3 men gathered around the pine table, and Banner untied the red strip and found folded inside it a small square of paper about the size of a playing card. He unfolded the paper carefully. There were 3 lines of writing on it in a blocky, uneducated hand. "The mouse is alive. Iron Hollow Ranch, awaiting instructions." Banner read the 3 lines twice without any expression on his face at all, and then he refolded the paper and set it on the table between them. Cass spoke first. "How long have they known?" "At least a week. Probably longer. This bird did not fly up here by itself. Someone walked part way up the slope to release it, and they released it close enough that it found its way to us. They are watching the house, Cass. They have been watching for a while, and they are only waiting for one thing." "The Chinook?" "The Chinook!" Jerry pressed his hands flat on the table. "Do we tell her?" Banner looked over at the closed door of Winnie's room. He could hear her in there humming softly to herself as she folded a shirt she had just finished mending. She had been humming more in the last few days. She had started to move through the house as if she belonged to it. "Not yet. Another week. She has earned it." He stood up from the table and walked to the window. "Start cleaning every rifle in this house, every pistol, every round of ammunition we have. I want the wolf traps reset along the north approach. 6 of them at least. Set them under fresh pine boughs so nobody sees them. I want the shutters reinforced with oak planking, and I want firing slots cut at the 4 cardinal windows. I want every head of good stock walked down into the box canyon by the end of next week. And I want that tunnel from the root cellar to the big Ponderosa out back dug deeper and wider so a grown woman can crawl through it in a hurry if she has to." "How long do you think we have, Banner?" "If the wind holds cold 3 weeks, maybe 4. And if it does not, then God help us, and we had better be ready by the end of this one." A week later, Banner sent Cass down the mountain. The cover story was a supply run to the trading post at the foot of the valley, and it was true enough that Cass bought flour and salt and a new set of horseshoes while he was there. But the real purpose of the trip was Silver City. And the real purpose of Silver City was information. Cass was gone 3 days. He rode back up the trail on the third afternoon with his saddlebags heavy and his face the color of old ash. He waited until Winnie had stepped out to the chicken coop before he spoke. "It is worse than we thought, Banner." He sat down at the table and told them what he had learned. He had spent one long evening in the back corner of a nameless whiskey house on the outskirts of Silver City, nursing a single drink and listening. Crenshaw, it seemed, had convened a public meeting at the Black Dog Saloon the previous week, standing on a card table and announcing to a room full of miners and gamblers that a young woman from Boston had stolen $2,000 in coin from his personal safe and had fled into the mountains with the help of the Whitlock outfit up at Iron Hollow Ranch. He had posted a reward, $1,000, dead or alive, and worse than that. He had purchased the cooperation of the county sheriff, a weak-jawed man named Budge Harlan, who owed Crenshaw 3 years of gambling debts. And Harlan had issued a warrant in Winnie's name for grand larceny. The warrant was technically legal. Any bounty hunter in the Idaho Territory could now ride up to Iron Hollow Ranch with that piece of paper in his pocket and demand they hand her over. "How many men has he got under arms?" Banner asked. "I counted 12 names on the payroll board behind the bar at the Black Dog. 12 regulars. Kettering is the worst of them, but he is not the only one I would worry about. There is a man called Jasper Voorhees who fought with Quantrill's raiders during the war. Another one named Silas Pratt, who killed a deputy United States Marshal up in Wyoming 2 years back and was never charged for it. These are not drunks with pistols, Banner. These are professionals." Banner absorbed this in silence. Then he said, "Jerry, when we tell her, I want you to be the one who explains the legal situation. You read more law than any of us. Explain to her what the warrant means and what it does not mean, and what her rights are in front of a real federal judge. Can you do that?" "I can." "Good, because we are telling her tomorrow." But the Chinook came that night, not tomorrow. Banner felt it on his face before he opened his eyes. He lay in his bunk in the pre-dawn dark, and he felt the warm, dry breath of it come in through the tiny gap under the window sash. And he knew without even having to look outside that the winter that had been their fortress had just become a door that was swinging wide open. He pulled on his boots and went out onto the porch. The wind was soft and dry, and it smelled of pine sap and distant grass the way the Chinook always smelled. The Salish people of the valleys below called it the Snow Eater, and in a single day a Chinook could take 2 feet of pack off a slope. By the time the sun set tonight, the trail up the mountain would be passable for a man on horseback. He went back inside. "Today, right now, I am telling her." He knocked softly on the door of her room, and when Winnie opened it, she saw his face, and she knew before he ever spoke that something had changed. "Will you come and sit at the table with me, Winnie?" So he told her. He told her everything. The star-shaped boot prints in the snow behind the boulder. The crow with the red strip on its leg. The message. The reward. The warrant for her arrest. The Chinook now blowing through the pines outside. Winnie listened without interrupting him. Her face went very still. When Banner finished speaking, she sat for a long time looking down at the steam rising off her coffee cup. Finally, she looked up. "I will leave tonight." "No. Banner, listen to me. You have given me my life. You do not owe me your death. If I leave tonight on foot, anyone who comes up this trail will find an empty cabin and 3 men who are not worth the trouble. No one has to die for me. Not one of you." Banner leaned forward across the table and he spoke to her very quietly, and his eyes did not leave hers for a single second. "Winifred Ashbrook, hear me now. When I knelt in the snow beside that boulder and carried you up that slope inside my coat, I swore an oath. I swore it to myself, and I swore it to the God I had not spoken to in 11 years. And I swore it on your life, because you did not yet have the breath to swear anything on your own behalf. The oath was that I would not let any harm come to you again while I drew breath. That is the oath of a man of Iron Hollow Ranch. It does not break. It does not get renegotiated. It does not bend for convenience. Obadiah Crenshaw and 12 hired men can come up this mountain if they want to come. I cannot stop them from riding, but I can promise you, and I do promise you, that every one of them who wants to lay a finger on you is going to have to walk across the bodies of 3 Iron Hollow men first. And I am here to promise you that it is not going to be an easy walk. Cass stood up from his chair. He did not say a word. He simply walked around the table and came and stood beside Banner. And then he folded his arms across his chest, and he looked at Winnie with the calm, unshakable expression of a man who had already decided. Jerry stood up next. He came around and stood on Banner's other side. He was the youngest and the gentlest, but his eyes did not waver. 3 men, 1 oath. Winifred Ashbrook looked at them standing there, and the tears came up at last. They came up fast and hot, and she pressed her hands to her mouth and she cried the way a person cries when they have spent their whole life waiting to belong to someone and have finally found out they do. I do not know how to thank you, she whispered through her hands. You do not thank us, Winnie, Banner said. Family does not thank family. That night, for the first time since the day she had arrived, Winifred Ashbrook did not sleep. She lay in her small bedroom and she listened to the wind change on the roof above her. The Chinook had been blowing all day, and now in the deep hours she could hear the slow melt beginning. The drip of water off the eaves, the soft occasional thump of snow sliding off the barn roof. Every one of those sounds was the sound of time running out. She slid out of her bed and pulled a wool shawl around her shoulders and opened her door and went out into the main room. Banner was there. He was where she had thought he would be, sitting in the wooden chair by the stove, the fire down to a low red glow, his hands empty in his lap for once. Not cleaning a rifle, not reading a ledger, just sitting. Waiting, she realized, for her. He looked up when she came in. She crossed the floor without speaking and sat down on the braided rug at his feet, and she leaned her cheek against the side of his knee, the way a child leans against a trusted parent. She closed her eyes, and for a long while neither of them said anything at all. Finally, Winnie spoke without lifting her head. Banner, I have never in my life had anyone of my own. Not my father, not my mother, no brother, no sister, not a friend I could run to when I was afraid. Not a single soul in this world belonged to me, and I did not belong to a single soul. For 22 years, I've been a piece of a person walking around in a coat, pretending to be a whole one. I came west because I thought God was going to give me a husband. I did not know he was going to give me a whole family, and I did not know he was going to give me you. Banner's hand came down very slowly and rested on the crown of her head, and his fingers moved once through her hair, and then they stilled there. Winnie, I am a man of 40 years. I have seen things no person should have to see. I carry a lot of dead inside of me, and I did not think there was any room left in me for a living thing. I did not think I was ever going to sit in this room with a woman again and feel my own heart come back to life the way it used to be before Eliza died. I did not know I still had a heart that could do that. She lifted her head then and looked up at him in the red firelight. His eyes were wet. She had not thought his eyes could be wet. He bent down and he kissed her once very softly on the mouth. It was the first kiss of her life. It was the first kiss of his in 11 years. It was a thing that happened in the space of 2 heartbeats, and it did not ask for anything, and it did not take anything. And when he drew back from her, she understood the way a person understands a verse they have read 100 times and have finally truly heard, that this was a man who would carry her name inside him for the rest of his days, whether he ever kissed her again or not. I am sorry, he whispered. I should not have. Do not be sorry, Banner. Please do not be sorry. He closed his eyes. Then he opened them and looked at her again. Go back to bed, Winnie. You need to sleep. Tomorrow is going to be a long day, and the day after that is going to be longer. She stood up. At the door of her small bedroom, she turned and looked back at him one more time. He was still sitting in the chair by the fire watching her go. She gave him a small, exhausted half smile, and he nodded to her once, and she closed the door. The next morning was the morning of the Last Supper. Banner knew it, and Cass knew it, and Jerry knew it, and Winnie knew it too, even though none of them said so out loud. The Chinook had worked all day and all night, and by mid-morning, the trail up from Miller's Crossing was a long ribbon of mud and broken crust. Any rider with a good horse could make it up now. They spent the day finishing the fortifications. Wolf traps along the north approach under fresh pine boughs, shutters reinforced with oak planking, firing slots cut at the four cardinal windows. The big mare and the two best working geldings walked down into the box canyon with a rope gate across the entrance. Ammunition brought up from the root cellar and stacked on the pine table in neat little pyramids of brass and lead. Winnie worked too. She loaded every revolver in the house with the careful attention Cass had taught her. She filled water pitchers and set them beside each window. She tore an old sheet into bandages and rolled them and set them with a bottle of whiskey and a threaded needle on a clean cloth by the hearth. She boiled a great pot of water and kept the fire under it low. And she slipped a small derringer that Cass had given her that afternoon into the pocket of her apron. At dusk, Banner came in from the yard and washed his hands at the basin and said, "Supper." They sat down at the long pine table. Winnie had made biscuits and a stew and a pot of coffee, so strong it could raise the dead. A single oil lamp burned in the middle of the table. Outside, the wind was still warm, and in the distance, faint as a rumor, they could hear the slow drip of the melt. Cass raised a small glass of whiskey, a thing he rarely did. "Gentlemen and Miss Winnie, I have been thinking about this all afternoon, and I want to say it before the sun goes down because tomorrow is not a day I want to go into without having said it first." Before Miss Winnie came up that trail, we were three wild dogs living under one roof. We called each other brothers, but we did not know what a family was. We knew loyalty and we knew work, but we did not know what it was to sit down at a table and feel like the table had a middle. Miss Winnie, you gave us a middle. You gave us something to sit around. If tomorrow is the last day any of us has on this earth, I want it written down somewhere that I do not regret a single minute of the last 3 weeks. Jerry raised his cup of water. "Miss Winnie, you are the sister I never had. I want you to know that. Whatever comes tomorrow morning, I want you to know I went into it, knowing what a sister was finally after 25 years, and I'm grateful." And then Banner. He lifted his glass last, and he simply looked across the table at Winifred Ashbrook, and his eyes were shining in the lamplight in a way that none of them had ever seen before. 11 years ago, I stood in the yard of this ranch, and I told the God of my father that I did not have anything left to give him. I was wrong. I know I was wrong because I am sitting here tonight at a table where a woman is reading a psalm every evening, and a boy who was dying in a snowdrift 20 days ago is pouring me a cup of coffee. And if that is not the work of the God I said I was done with, then I do not know what it is, and I am not going to pretend anymore. Winnie, you did not come up this mountain by accident. You did not find this door by accident. You were sent. And I want to say that out loud in this room in front of these two boys because I want the walls of this house to hear me say it while there is still time. You were sent. And whatever comes through that door tomorrow morning is going to have to come through me first. He drank the whiskey. Winnie sat with her hands folded on the table. Her eyes were full. When she finally spoke, she spoke quietly, and she said only 4 words. "Read the psalm, Jerry." Jerry fetched the Ashbrook family Bible and set it in her hands. Winnie opened to the 23rd Psalm one more time. The 3 men bowed their heads. The oil lamp flickered between them. Outside, the warm wind moved through the pines, and the night beyond, the wind was very dark and very close. She began to read. She read all the way through this time, every word. And when she came to the line that Banner had not been able to sit through 20 days before she read it clearly and without hurrying, and he kept his head bowed, and he did not walk out of the room. Somewhere outside in the pines, a single horse nickered low. None of the 4 people at the table heard it yet. But tomorrow would hear it. Tomorrow would hear everything. The morning that came after the last supper at Iron Hollow Ranch came in red. It came in red the way a wound comes in. The eastern sky above the pass rose up in a slow bloom of scarlet and orange that bled across the melting snowfield and turned the whole of the yard the color of a fresh cut. Bannister Whitlock stood on the porch with a tin cup of black coffee in one hand and his Winchester leaning against the rail beside him, and he looked at that sky for a long time before he spoke. "Red Dawn," he said quietly. Cassius Redfern came up beside him with a rifle of his own across his shoulder. "Sailor's warning. This is not a sailor sky, Cass. This is a man sky, and the warning is for us." Somewhere inside the house, Winnie was pouring fresh coffee into the tin cups they would carry to their firing positions. Somewhere behind the house, Jerry was making a final check of the tunnel that ran from the root cellar to the big ponderosa pine, crawling through it on his hands and knees, with a lantern in his teeth to be sure the packed earth had not collapsed overnight from the warm wind. Banner set his coffee down on the rail. He turned to Cass. "You go on the roof. Take the Henry repeater. Take the spyglass in the extra cartridge box. Do not fire until I fire. When I fire, start with the man on the far right of their line, because the man on the far right is always the one most likely to circle." "I understand, Banner." Jerry inside at the west window with the Winchester 73. Winnie at the east window with the Colt and the Derringer in reserve. I will stand at the front door. And if they come from the back, then the wolf traps along the north approach will tell us, and Jerry will move to the back window. But they will not come from the back first. Crenshaw is too proud a man to creep in the back door of anywhere. He will come straight up the front of this ranch because he wants to stand in my yard and tell me to hand her over. That is the kind of man he is. He needs the yard. He needs the words. Cass looked at him sidelong. And when he has had his words, then I am going to give him an answer he will remember. They stood there in the red dawn a little while longer. Two men who had ridden together for 9 winters. There was nothing left to say. Every word that had been worth saying had already been said the night before at the supper table. And a man does not repeat that kind of thing in the morning. He carries it in his chest and he goes to work. Inside the house, Winnie came to the front door with 2 cups of coffee. She handed one up to Cass for the roof and one to Banner for the porch. Her hands did not shake. That was the thing Banner noticed, and he would remember it for the rest of his life. Her hands did not shake. "Banner," she said quietly. "Yes, Winnie. Whatever happens today, I want you to know that if I had the chance to walk up that trail again from Miller's Crossing, knowing everything I know now, I would walk it the same way. Every step." He looked at her for a long moment in the red dawn. The light caught in her gray eyes and turned them the color of copper. He did not trust himself to say what he wanted to say. He only nodded once. But the nod said everything. She went back inside. The door closed softly behind her. They waited. An hour passed. The red of the sky bled away into the pale blue of a thawing November morning. The melt resumed with the sun, and all around the ranch, the slow dripping sound of winter ending went on and on like a clock that would not stop. Another hour passed, and then Cass's voice came down from the roof, low and flat. "Banner! Movement!" Banner went very still. "Where south, along the tree line above the box canyon, I count 11 riders. 11. Crenshaw is in the second rank riding a bay, black overcoat. Kettering is riding point." Banner closed his eyes for half a second. 11 was more than he had hoped for. He had been telling himself 8 or 9. 11 was a number that meant somebody was going to die on this porch today, and he was going to have to be very precise about who. How are they moving? Slow, in a loose column, no flankers yet. Stay down until they clear the tree line. When they hit the open ground between the fence and the house, call it. Do not fire. He stepped back inside the house. Jerry was at the west window with the Winchester across his knees. Winnie was at the east window with the Colt laid on the sill and the Derringer in her apron pocket. And her face was the face of a woman who had already walked through a valley of shadow once in her life and had decided she would not flinch at the second. "They are here," Banner said. Jerry swallowed once. "How many?" 11. Jerry nodded. His jaw was set. 25 years old, and he said nothing else. And Banner felt a flash of pride so sharp it almost hurt him. He went to the front door and took up his position just inside it with the Winchester in both hands and the muzzle pointed at the floor, and he waited for the sound of hoofbeats on the thawing earth of his own yard. The riders came clear of the tree line at a walking pace. They stopped about 60 yards from the porch at the edge of rifle range, but well short of the point where a bullet could be guaranteed to do its work. For a long moment, the two sides looked at each other across the thawing snow. Then Crenshaw stood up in his stirrups. He was a short man, heavy in the belly, dressed in a black overcoat that was too fine for an Idaho rancher and a flat-brimmed hat that had been brushed clean for the occasion. His face at this distance was a pale smudge, but his voice carried across the open ground with the practiced projection of a saloon keeper who had spent 20 years shouting over poker tables. "Bannister Whitlock, I know you are in there. I know you have my Boston mouse inside that house. This is not your quarrel, Mr. Whitlock. She stole $2,000 from my private safe and ran for the high country. I forgive you for taking her in. I am a forgiving man. Send her out, and I will pay you $500 in good Wells Fargo script for your trouble. You have 10 minutes to think it over." He sat back down in his saddle. He folded his hands on the pommel. He waited. Bannister Whitlock stood inside his own front door for 30 seconds without moving. He was not thinking about the offer. He was thinking about angles. He was thinking about the position of the man third from the left, who was riding a nervous paint horse that kept trying to drift sideways. He was thinking about where the wolf trap lay, buried on the north approach, just off the flank of Crenshaw's formation. He was thinking about which man would be the first to make a mistake. Then he opened the door. He stepped just over the threshold with the Winchester, raised the stock set against his shoulder, and he pitched his voice across the yard in the flat, dry tone of a man who was tired of the sound of other men's words. "Crenshaw." "Yes, Mr. Whitlock." "There is a line in the book of Proverbs. It says, 'He that diggeth a pit shall fall into it.' You dug this pit. You pointed a young woman up a trail in a blizzard because she was poor. You sent Lazarus Kettering to stand behind a rock and watch her die. You put a bounty on her head when the mountain did not finish your killing for you. You dug the pit, Mr. Crenshaw, and now, sir, I'm going to invite you to step into it." He fired. The Winchester barked once, and the hat flew off Obadiah Crenshaw's head and spun into the snow beside his horse and rolled and stopped. And Crenshaw went sideways out of his saddle with a strangled shout that was not fear and was not pain, but was the particular sound a bully makes when he discovers that someone has decided not to be afraid of him anymore. That was the first shot. The second shot came 3 seconds later from the roof. Cassius Redfern had been watching the two riders on the far right of the line from the very beginning because Banner had told him to, and when the Winchester barked below, Cass put his eye to the front sight of the Henry repeater and squeezed. 200 yards of cold thawing air. The iron sights of a Henry were not meant for that kind of work. But Cass had been shooting at knotholes in a Texas barn wall since he was 12 years old, and his hand remembered things his mind had long since stopped thinking about. The shot took the rider on the far right through the shoulder blade and knocked him sideways out of the saddle, and the man hit the snow and did not get up. The other rider on the far right wheeled his horse to bolt for the tree line and rode directly into the wolf trap Banner had set under the pine boughs 3 days ago. The trap closed on the horse's foreleg with a sound like the snap of a green branch, and the horse screamed and went down in a thrashing tangle of legs and leather, and its rider went over the pommel into a drift. And by the time he clawed his way free, Cass's second shot had found him between the shoulder and the neck, and he sat down very slowly in the snow. "2 down," Cass called from the roof. 9 left. Down on the open ground, Crenshaw was screaming orders and crawling on his belly behind a fallen cedar log for cover. "Take the house, shoot the roof off that son of a dog." The remaining riders broke from their column and fanned out. 5 of them spurred their horses forward in a ragged charge across the thawing yard, firing revolvers from the saddle. The other 2 dismounted and went flat in the snow behind the log with Crenshaw. Banner had been waiting for the charge. He braced the Winchester against the doorframe, and he fired 3 shots in 5 seconds. And the shooting of Bannister Whitlock that day would be told about in Silver City for 30 years afterward by men who had not even been there to see it. The first shot took the lead charger clean off his horse. The second shot took the man just behind him. The third shot went through the crown of a gray felt hat and the skull beneath it, and the third man pitched forward over his horse's neck and was dragged for 10 yards before his boot came loose of the stirrup. 3 shots. 3 men. 5 down, Banner called to the room behind him. 6 left. The 2 remaining mounted riders broke off the charge. One wheeled his horse and bolted for the cover of the lean-to. The other turned his horse sideways to use it as a shield, which was a mistake because it took Cass on the roof less than 2 seconds to put a round from the Henry through the horse's shoulder. The horse went down hard. The rider kicked free and ran hunched low back toward the cedar log. 6 down, Cass called. Inside the house at the east window, Winifred Ashbrook crouched beside the sill with the Colt in her hands, and her breath coming hard and steady. She was watching her sector the way Cass had taught her, and she was not firing yet because Cass had told her never to fire until she had a clean target, because the sound of a woman's revolver from inside a house would tell the enemy exactly which window to come for. That was when they heard the footstep behind them. It was the smallest sound. It was the sound a man makes when he has crept along the back wall of a house with the melt dripping around him and has come in through the back door that was supposed to be bolted and was not because in the chaos of the first shots, the bolt had been overlooked and has now stepped onto the bearskin rug in the back hallway and is trying very hard not to be heard. Jerry turned his head 1/4 of an inch. Lazarus Kettering stood in the doorway of the hallway with a long-bladed Bowie knife in his right hand and a Remington Army revolver in his left, and his eyes were the color of a river bottom, and his black mustache was wet with melting snow. And there was a slow, tight grin on his face that said he had done this before, and this was the part he enjoyed. He raised the Remington. "Jerry!" Winnie screamed. Jerry moved. He moved the way a man moves when 25 years of being the smallest and the quickest has taught him that speed is the only gift he is going to get in a fight. He threw himself sideways off his chair just as the Remington went off, and the round meant for his heart went through the wooden frame of the west window 6 inches above his head. Jerry hit the floor rolling and came up inside the reach of Kettering's pistol arm and drove his shoulder into the bigger man's ribs, and they went down together in a tangle of limbs. The Remington fell away. The Bowie knife did not. Jericho Hadley had fought for his life in Kansas alleys when he was 12 years old, and he had fought for his food at train stations when he was 13, and every one of those fights had taught him that if you were smaller than your enemy, you could not afford to be slower. He got his left hand on Kettering's knife wrist and his right elbow into Kettering's throat, and he held on. And Kettering, who was bigger and heavier and meaner, began to twist the knife down toward him inch by inch. The blade came down toward Jerry's face. Jerry's arm shook. His elbow was not enough. Kettering was grinning now, that slow, tight grin, because he could feel the younger man's strength beginning to go. The blade touched the skin under Jerry's left eye. A thin red line opened. "Hold still, boy," Kettering whispered. "This is going to be quick." Then the world went white with a sound like a slammed door. The report of a Colt peacemaker fired inside a wood-walled room is not like the report of a rifle fired outside. It is a physical thing. It slaps the air and the walls and the inside of your skull, and for half a second after it, every other sound in the world stops. Lazarus Kettering's right shoulder jerked backward as if an invisible hand had yanked it, and the Bowie knife fell out of his grip and clattered across the floorboards, and the slow, tight grin drained off his face the way the politeness had drained off it 3 weeks ago at Miller's Crossing. Winifred Ashbrook stood in the middle of the main room with the Colt peacemaker still raised and the smoke still drifting from the muzzle, and her gray eyes as wide and steady as a winter sky. She had fired her 11th shot of her life. The previous 10 had been at tin cans on stumps. Jericho Hadley, with blood running down his cheek from the thin red line under his eye, shoved Kettering off him and scrambled up and grabbed the fallen Remington in one motion, and he put the barrel of it against Kettering's forehead. His face was the face of a man who wanted very much to pull the trigger and was not going to because he had been raised by a man who did not pull triggers once the fight was over. Jerry, it was Winnie's voice behind him. Still steady, barely. Jerry, do not, please. I am not going to miss Winnie. I am not. Kettering made a wet sound. His shoulder was ruined. He was not going to be a problem for the rest of this fight. Jerry dragged him by the collar into the corner and threw a loop of leather cord around his wrist behind his back and pulled it tight. Winnie still had the Colt raised. Her arms were beginning to tremble now. Only now. And Jerry came to her quickly and closed his hand gently over her wrist and lowered the gun for her. Miss Winnie, look at me. She looked. You just saved my life. Do you hear me? You just saved my life. And there is nothing in the good book that holds that against a person. Nothing. You did the right thing. I shot a man, Jerry. You shot a man who was 2 seconds from cutting my throat. There is a difference between killing and defending, and the Lord knows the difference even when we cannot feel it yet. You were defending your family. Do you hear me? I hear you. Good. Now I need you back at your window because this is not over yet. She went. Outside, the second stage of the battle had already begun. Cass on the roof and Banner in the door had the surviving Crenshaw men pinned down behind the cedar log, and the Crenshaw men were discovering that they did not have a good plan for what to do when their plan stopped working. 2 more of them tried to break for the tree line and were cut down before they made 30 yards. Another one threw down his rifle and raised his hands, and Bannister Whitlock, who was many things but was not a murderer, called from the door, "Walk out into the middle of the yard. Hands on your head. No sudden movement." And the man walked out and dropped to his knees in the melting snow. That left Crenshaw and 1 man beside him behind the cedar log. Crenshaw had been hiding behind that log for 4 minutes now. And 4 minutes is a very long time to crouch in slush while your hired gunmen die around you one at a time. The last man was beginning to figure out that the math no longer favored the people who were paying him. And when men like that figure that out, they do the thing they always do. He ran. He came up out of the slush and bolted for the tree line at a dead sprint, and he made it 6 strides before Cass took him cleanly from the roof. 10 down, Cass called, and that left 1. Obadiah Crenshaw was alone behind the cedar log with 10 men down around him and the thaw water running in slow rivulets past his boots. And after a long moment, he made a decision that did not surprise Banner at all. He stood up. He did not stand up to surrender. He ran in a low crouch to the horse of one of his dead men, hauled himself into the saddle, and spurred that horse hard down the back trail toward Miller's Crossing at a flat run. Banner had been waiting for this too. He stepped out of the front door onto the porch. "Cass, hold the yard. Jerry, watch Kettering and keep Winnie with you. I am going after him." "Banner, do not argue with me." "Cass, this part is mine. I promised this part to myself on the first day I came back from the boulder. Hold the house." He whistled once, a short, sharp note. Out of the lean to his black gelding, Shadow came at a trot, already saddled because Banner had saddled him before dawn. Banner swung up into the saddle in a single motion and laid the Winchester across his thighs and kicked Shadow into a gallop. And man and horse shot out of the yard in pursuit of the last living man who had come up the mountain to kill Winifred Ashbrook. The back trail from Iron Hollow Ranch down toward Miller's Crossing was 2.5 miles of switchbacks through melting pine forest. Shadow was a better horse than Crenshaw's stolen mount, and Banner knew every turn of the trail. By the time they had gone half a mile, Banner had closed the gap from 200 yards to 70. Crenshaw looked back once over his shoulder and saw how close Banner was, and his face went the color of the belly of a fish. He clawed at his waist for the pistol he carried there, and he turned awkwardly in the saddle and fired blind over his shoulder. The shot went wild in the general sense and found its mark in the specific sense. It went past Banner's head by 6 inches and clipped the top of his left arm just below the shoulder, and a line of fire opened along the muscle there. Banner grunted once and the Winchester went sideways in his hands, and he dropped from Shadow's back and rolled into the soft melting snow beside the trail with his left arm going numb underneath him. Crenshaw reined up hard. He looked back. He saw Banner lying in the snow, not moving. He saw Shadow trotting riderless down the trail with empty stirrups swinging. A slow, cold smile spread across Obadiah Crenshaw's face. He dismounted. He walked back up the trail with his pistol drawn, squelching through the melt, and he came up beside the crumpled shape in the snow, and he nudged it once with his boot. Not so big now, are you, mountain man? That was when Bannister Whitlock opened his eyes and brought the Winchester up from where it had been lying underneath him, and he fired once from flat on his back, and the round took Obadiah Crenshaw in the right knee and blew the joint apart, and Crenshaw went down screaming into the slush of the thawing trail. Banner stood up slowly. His left arm hung wrong. His shirt sleeve was already dark with blood. He walked over to where Crenshaw was writhing in the snow, and he kicked the pistol out of the man's reach. And then he planted the stock of the Winchester against his own hip and aimed the muzzle down at Crenshaw's face. Crenshaw was crying now. The slow, cold smile was gone. He looked up at Banner with the terrified eyes of a man who had only ever been on the giving end of pain and had never once imagined he would be on the receiving end of it. "Do it!" Crenshaw screamed. "Do it, you self-righteous fool! You are no different than I am, Whitlock! You killed for the Union when you were a boy, and you killed for your ranch when you were a man, and now you are going to kill for your little Boston Bible girl. So stop pretending and do it." Bannister Whitlock looked down at him for a long, quiet moment. He felt the pull of it. He would not pretend later to himself or to anyone else that he had not felt it. A lifetime of stored-up iron, and every ounce of it wanted him to pull the trigger right now and end Obadiah Crenshaw and be done with the whole rotten business. And then Banner thought of Winnie Ashbrook reading the 23rd Psalm by lamplight at his supper table. And then he thought of the hairline crack she had opened in the stone wall of his chest on the night of the blizzard. And then he thought of the oath, and he understood with the slow, clean understanding of a man who has finally reached the end of a long argument with himself, that the man who killed Obadiah Crenshaw in cold blood on a thawing trail would not be a man fit to stand beside Winifred Ashbrook at any altar that had ever been built. He took his finger off the trigger. "No, Crenshaw, I am not going to kill you." "What? You wanted me to kill you. That is why you goaded me. You know exactly what waits for you in Helena once the federal marshal gets his hands on you. You know about the rope and the crowd and the slow walk up the steps. You would rather die here quick and angry in the snow than die there slow in public with your name in the newspapers. You want the easy death. I am not going to give it to you." He paused. "You sent that woman up my trail in a blizzard to freeze because she was poor. You sent Lazarus Kettering to stand behind a rock and watch her die. You put a price on her head. You turned the law of this territory into a weapon against a woman who had never in her life done anything except pray to her own God. And now you are going to walk on that ruined knee every step of the way down this mountain behind my horse. And you are going to stand trial in Helena in front of a federal judge. And you are going to hang in front of a crowd of the decent people you have spent your life preying on. That is the price of the pit you dug, Mr. Crenshaw. Not a bullet in the snow, a rope in the sun." He lowered the Winchester. He bent down slowly because his left arm was going bad on him, and he pulled a length of rope from the saddlebag of Shadow, who had trotted back up beside him. He tied Obadiah Crenshaw's hands behind his back with the careful knots of a man who had tied cattle and men in his time. Then he tied the other end of the rope to his own saddle horn. "Get up, Mr. Crenshaw. We are going home." He mounted Shadow one-handed, and he turned the black horse around, and he started back up the trail toward Iron Hollow Ranch at a slow, deliberate walk with the rope taut behind him. Crenshaw crawled. When Banner came back into the yard of Iron Hollow Ranch, pulling a bleeding man on a rope behind him, the sun had climbed halfway up the pale Idaho sky, and the yard was strewn with the bodies of the men who had come up this mountain to kill a woman who prayed. Cass was down off the roof now, moving among the fallen. Jerry was on the porch with the captured survivor under guard. Kettering was slumped against the far wall of the main room, still tied, still bleeding, still alive. and Winifred Ashbrook came out of the house at a run. She saw Banner on Shadow, and she saw the blood on his left sleeve that had run all the way down to his wrist and was dripping off his fingers onto the pommel, and she ran to him without thinking about the mud or the dead men or the rope or the fat man on his hands and knees at the end of it. Banner, not Mr. Whitlock. Banner. The first time she had said his given name in the yard where anyone could hear it, and the sound of it in her voice went through him like a bell. He started to swing his right leg over to dismount, and his left arm gave out, and he would have gone down in the mud if Winnie had not already been there under his good shoulder. She took his weight as if he weighed nothing. She guided him down. She steadied him on his feet. Cass, Jerry, inside now. I need the kitchen table cleared and the whiskey and the needle and the lantern lit. Tie this man to the post in the horse corral and leave him there. We will deal with him when we have dealt with my husband. She did not realize until an hour later that she had said the word "my husband" out loud in front of two cowboys and a federal prisoner and a dying man. Neither did any of the men. It was the kind of truth that had simply walked into the room ahead of the ceremony and sat down and waited to be noticed. On the kitchen table of Iron Hollow Ranch in the slanting light of a late morning that smelled of pine and wet earth in the end of a long winter, Winifred Ashbrook stitched the bullet wound in Bannister Whitlock's left arm with the bone needles from her mother's sewing kit and thread she had dipped in whiskey to clean it. Her hands were perfectly steady. They had shaken earlier when she had lowered the Colt after shooting Kettering, but they did not shake now because Banner's life was inside those hands, and there was no room in her for shaking. He watched her face as she worked, the small line of concentration between her brows, the way her lower lip was caught between her teeth, the way her eyes, which had been the color of storm water 3 weeks ago, were now the color of a clear morning sky. Winnie. Hush, Banner. I am almost done. 2 more stitches. Winnie, what is it? You shot a man in my house today. Her hands faltered for half a second. Then they steadied. She drew the needle through again. Yes. How do you feel about it? She finished the last stitch before she answered. She tied the thread off and cut it and set the needle down, and only then did she look up. I feel that there is a difference between killing and defending, and that the Lord knows the difference. I feel that I love Jerry the way a sister loves a brother, and the idea of losing him was more than I could bear. And I feel that God will forgive the kind of shooting I did this morning because he is a better accountant of intent than we are. Banner looked at her a long time then. Then he reached out with his good right hand, and he took her left hand, and he held it. Winifred Ashbrook, I have one more question for you today, and I need you to hear it clean because I am not a man who says this kind of thing twice. I am listening. Winnie, will you marry me? Not as a mail-order bride to a man from an advertisement. Not as a charity case to a rancher who took you in out of a blizzard. Not for any reason except that I have loved you since the night you told me your mother had prayed for a man like me to come and find you. I have loved you since I heard you read the 23rd Psalm all the way through to the end and watched my own wall come down. I am 40 years old, Winnie. I have a hole in me where my first wife used to live. I have put that hole in order at last, and what I am offering you is not the heart I had before. It is the heart I have now. It is the heart you built back. Will you take it? Winifred Ashbrook did not answer right away. She brought his rough, calloused hand up to her cheek, and she pressed it there. And she closed her eyes, and 2 slow tears slid down her face and ran over the back of his hand. And when she finally opened her eyes, she was smiling. Yes, Bannister Whitlock. 1,000 times, yes. She bent down and she kissed him once very gently on the mouth. It was their second kiss. The first had been in front of a dying fire in the small hours of the morning, with the Chinook wind whispering outside. The second was at the kitchen table of Iron Hollow Ranch, in the middle of a Tuesday in November, with her husband to be bleeding through a fresh bandage. And somehow that second kiss felt like a wedding all by itself. From the doorway came the sound of 2 cowboys trying not to cry and failing. Cassius Redfern wiped his face with the back of his wrist and said in the roughest voice he could manage, "It is about damn time, Banner." Jericho Hadley, whose left cheek now wore the thin red line Kettering had given him, and who would wear that scar for the rest of his life, said very softly, "Worth the wait." A week later, when Banner's arm had begun to heal enough that he could ride the four of them, went down the mountain to Helena. They took with them Lazarus Kettering and Obadiah Crenshaw bound in the back of a buckboard wagon that Cass had borrowed from the nearest decent neighbor. The trip took 3 days. On the second day, they came upon an immigrant wagon that had broken an axle in the mud of the thawing track, and Bannister Whitlock, with two bound outlaws in his own wagon and a bullet wound stitched in his left arm, ordered his brothers to stop and help. Cass looked at him in disbelief for about 3 seconds and then obeyed without arguing because the code of the West did not make exceptions for convenience. They spent 4 hours with the immigrant family. Cass and Jerry cut and fitted a new axle from a pine they felled beside the trail. Winnie sat with the immigrant's wife and her three small children and fed them biscuits from her own basket and prayed with them over the cold supper fire. The immigrant's name was Jonas Whitaker, and he had lost a brother in Silver City the previous spring to a man named Obadiah Crenshaw over a card game gone wrong. When Jonas Whitaker recognized the fat man tied in the back of the Whitlock wagon, he stood very still for a long moment, and then he walked over to Banner and gripped his good right hand in both of his. "Mr. Whitlock, I do not know what led you to do this thing that no one else in this territory was willing to do, but I am going to tell my children and my grandchildren the name of the man who brought Obadiah Crenshaw down from the sawtooth in the back of a wagon. You have my thanks, sir, for the rest of my days." They came into Helena on the afternoon of the third day. The federal marshal, a gray-haired man named Ezra Locke, who had been hunting Obadiah Crenshaw without success for 6 months, stood on the steps of the federal courthouse and watched Bannister Whitlock drive his wagon up the main street of Helena with two chained men in the back and two mounted cowboys flanking it, and a young woman with dark honey hair in a clean gray dress riding beside the driver's bench. And the marshal took off his hat and said out loud to no one in particular, "Well, I will be a son of a gun." Inside the federal courthouse, the marshal took down the whole of Winifred Ashbrook's testimony in the presence of a circuit judge named Barnaby Whitcomb. It took 4 hours. She did not weep. She told every part of it, from the advertisement in the Matrimonial Herald to the widow on the train to the $19, to Lazarus Kettering at Miller's Crossing, to the 3 miles in the blizzard, to the boulder, to the moment when Bannister Whitlock had knelt beside her in the snow and spoken a prayer he had not spoken in a decade. She laid her grandmother's Bible on the judge's desk as evidence. Judge Barnaby Whitcomb listened without interruption. When Winnie was done, the judge cleaned his spectacles on a handkerchief and said, "Miss Ashbrook, in 41 years on the bench, I have heard a great many stories. I have not heard many like yours." The trial was held 3 weeks later. Obadiah Crenshaw was convicted of federal mail fraud, attempted murder, and the first-degree conspiracy to commit murder corruption of a county officer, and 5 lesser counts. The sentence was the rope. Lazarus Kettering was sentenced to 20 years of hard labor at the federal prison in Deer Lodge. He would not survive the first 5. Obadiah Crenshaw was hanged on a bright autumn morning in the public square of Helena, in front of a crowd of 200 townspeople, many of whom had lost money or friends or daughters to him over the years. Winifred Ashbrook did not attend. She remained at the boarding house where the 4 of them were staying, and she read from the Psalms, and she prayed for the soul of the man who had tried to kill her. Because she had been raised to believe that a Christian woman prayed even for her enemies, especially when they were at the end of their road. Bannister Whitlock did not attend either. He stayed with her. On a bright afternoon in May of 1889, with the last of the snow gone from the lower slopes of the Sawtooth and the first wildflowers beginning to show in the meadow behind Iron Hollow Ranch, Bannister Whitlock and Winifred Ashbrook were married on the front porch of the main house by a circuit preacher named Mordecai Clemens, who had ridden up from Helena for the occasion. The wedding was small and it was perfect. Winnie wore a white dress that had been sent to her as a gift from a woman named Henrietta Pruitt, the widow in the black mourning dress on the Dakota train, who had read about the Iron Hollow story in the Helena newspaper and had tracked Winnie down by letter. The dress had been her own wedding dress 30 years before, and she had sent it with a note that said, I prayed for you every night, child, just as I promised. Wear this in remembrance of the prayers that were answered." Banner wore a clean white shirt and his best black coat. In his breast pocket, folded very small, was a page from the Ashbrook family Bible containing the 23rd Psalm, which Winnie had placed there herself that morning. Cassius Redfern stood as best man in a shirt that Winnie had ironed for him the night before, and he did not say a single word through the whole ceremony, because if he had opened his mouth, he would have wept, and Cassius Redfern did not intend to weep at his brother's wedding. Jericho Hadley read from 1 Corinthians. "Love suffereth long and is kind." He read in a clear, steady voice, and he did not stumble once. When Reverend Clemens asked, "Do you, Bannister Whitlock, take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife, in sickness and in health, for richer and for poorer, until death do you part?" Banner did not hesitate. "I do, until the day I die, and after." And Winifred Ashbrook became Winifred Whitlock on the porch of Iron Hollow Ranch under a May sky so blue it looked like the color of hope itself. That evening, after the last of the small gathering had drifted down the slope toward their own wagons, and after Cass and Jerry had walked out to the new cabin they had built together that spring, a half-mile from the main house to give the newlyweds their privacy, Banner Whitlock took Winnie's hand and walked her into the small room at the back of the main house that had become their bedroom. He paused at the threshold. "Winnie, I have waited a long time to know a woman again. I can wait another night if that is what you want. I can wait another 10 nights. You are the one who chooses, not me." Her answer was to lift up on her toes and kiss him, and then to take his good right hand in both of hers and draw him gently through the doorway. The door closed softly behind them. And when morning came, a new life had begun in the house at the end of the valley. 6 years passed over Iron Hollow Ranch, the way 6 years pass over any piece of ground that is loved and worked and prayed over. The cattle were bred and sold and bred again. The barn was expanded twice. A small schoolhouse was built down the slope near the main road. And Cassius Redfern married a bright Irish girl named Maeve O'Reilly, whose laughter carried across the yard on warm summer evenings the way a wind chime carries. Jericho Hadley went to Helena for 2 years to read the law under Judge Whitcomb, and he came back with a license to practice, and he opened the only honest legal office in Silver City, and he married the school teacher there, a patient woman named Prudence Wentworth. And Banner and Winnie Whitlock had 2 children. The first was a boy born in the summer of 1891, and they named him Caleb after Winnie's father. The second was a girl born in the spring of 1893, and they named her Mercy, because that was what they had been given. On a warm afternoon in early May of 1895, Bannister Whitlock sat on the porch of Iron Hollow Ranch with Caleb on one knee and Mercy on the other, and the Ashbrook family Bible open across both of them, reading aloud from the 23rd Psalm, in a voice that Caleb, who was almost 4 years old, had begun to recognize as the voice his father used for the most important words. Winnie came out of the house behind them with a basket of clean laundry against her hip and paused in the doorway to watch her husband and her children in the slanting gold light of the late afternoon. Her hair was still the color of dark honey. There were the smallest lines now at the corners of her eyes. She was 28 years old, and she was beautiful in a way she had not been at 22. Which is to say, she was beautiful like a woman who had been loved every day for 6 years and had counted every single one of them. Banner looked up and saw her standing there. He smiled. It was a smile he had not had in him 7 years ago. He had a whole collection of smiles now, and Winifred had built every single one of them. Out in the yard, Cassius Redfern came riding up from the south pasture, leading a young colt he had been gentling for a week. Behind him, walking from the cabin Cass shared with Maeve, came Maeve herself with her baby boy Connor in her arms. From the other direction, up the wagon road, came Jerry and Prudence, in the small buggy Jerry had bought in Helena, waving as they came into view. They were coming for supper. They came for supper every Sunday now. It was a tradition of Iron Hollow Ranch, and it was the tradition of the Whitlock family. And it was in a way that Winnie alone could see the answer to the prayer she had prayed on the narrow bed in her uncle's attic on Beacon Street in Boston when she was 15 years old and newly orphaned and alone in the world. "Please send me somebody who will not leave me alone." She had asked for one. She had been given 6. 7, if you counted God himself, who had started the whole thing moving with a single strange November afternoon in a sky gone the wrong color over the Sawtooth Range. Winifred Whitlock set the laundry basket down on the porch and went to her husband and her children. Banner shifted Caleb to make room for her on the bench. She sat down beside him and leaned her head against his shoulder, and the four of them sat in the sun and watched their family come home. Far off over the ridge, a crow flew from the top of one tall pine to another. Just a blackbird in a blue sky now, no longer a messenger of any kind. Banner looked out at the mountains. He spoke too quietly for anyone but Winnie to hear. I used to think my life ended in a snowstorm, Winnie. She turned her face up to him. And now I know my life began in one. She closed her eyes and she smiled and she pressed closer against his shoulder. And the sun went down slowly behind the Sawtooth Peaks, and Iron Hollow Ranch lay under a gold light that was the color of grace. And the last page of the 23rd Psalm lay open on Bannister Whitlock's knee, where his thumb was resting on the final line. Surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life, and I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever. The oath had been kept. The valley had been walked, and the storm that had started it all had become in the end the best thing that ever happened to the man who had stood in his yard watching a purple sky come in over the mountains and had felt against all his long, stubborn denial the whisper at the back of his neck that told him somebody was out there and somebody needed him. He had gone out into the storm. He had brought her home, and home was what she had made of him in the years that followed, one quiet day at a time, until there was no telling any more where Bannister Whitlock ended and Winifred Whitlock began, and that in the country of the Sawtooth Range in the year 1895 was the only ending that any of them would ever have needed.